We'd been hiking all day, the weight of our packs growing heavier with each mile. Our goal was to reach a remote part of the forest where we could set up camp away from all signs of civilization. By the time we found a clearing to set up for the night, the sky had begun to darken. We quickly built a fire, spreading out our sleeping bags and gathering around to eat. The trees stood tall and dense around us, casting long, twisting shadows that danced with the firelight. It was so quiet that even the smallest rustle seemed loud, the forest pressing in on us from all sides. As the night wore on, our laughter and conversation faded, replaced by the quiet sounds of crackling wood and occasional night birds. It was peaceful, at least at first. Then we began to hear a distant noise, a slow, dragging sound like something being pulled through the underbrush. We all went silent, staring into the darkness, but the noise quickly stopped. Probably an animal, I thought, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Trying to brush it off, we resumed talking, but every so often, we heard it again, a dragging, shuffling sound, inching closer each time. I shined my flashlight into the trees, but saw nothing, just empty woods stretching into darkness. We told ourselves it was a deer, or maybe some fallen branches shifting in the wind, but then we heard something new, a slow, rhythmic tapping coming from deep in the woods. It was faint at first, like the sound of a branch hitting a tree, but it was too steady, too deliberate. We listened, each of us trying to figure out where it was coming from, but the tapping seemed to circle us, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern around the clearing. My friend suggested we head to bed, so we each retreated to our tents, trying to ignore the unsettling sounds. I lay still, listening, my heart pounding. Just as I was starting to calm down, I heard footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the leaves. They stopped just outside, and I held my breath, not daring to move. Then came a scratching sound along the outside of my tent, as if fingers were dragging across the fabric. I stayed frozen, listening, hoping it would stop. Then came a whisper, low and gravelly, barely audible. "Let me in." My heart stopped. The whisper was right outside my tent, close enough that I could feel the breath through the thin fabric. The footsteps started up again, shuffling away from my tent and toward my friends. I could hear them stop. Then the same scratching, the same chilling whisper, soft but distinct. "Let me in." I wanted to yell out, to warn him, but my voice caught in my throat. The footsteps moved to the next tent, the scratching and whispering starting again. One by one, it went to each of our tents, as though it was trying to pick us off, one by one. Then silence. I lay still, straining to hear, hoping it was over. Suddenly, there was a loud crash right outside my tent. Something heavy slammed into the ground, and the whole tent shook. I clutched my flashlight, barely breathing. Then came a dragging sound, as though something was being pulled right past my tent. It was close, too close, just inches away from where I lay. In the silence that followed, I gathered the courage to unzip the tent just a fraction. Shining my flashlight into the clearing, I nearly screamed. Lying in the middle of our campsite was an old, tattered doll, its face cracked and smeared with dirt, one eye missing. The doll's head was tilted at an odd angle, staring directly at my tent. We all scrambled out of our tents, each of us staring at the doll in shock, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. It hadn't been there when we set up camp, and none of us had brought it. My friend grabbed a stick and poked it, but it didn't move. He kicked it toward the edge of the clearing, and we all stood in tense silence, waiting to see if anything happened. We decided to put out the fire and move our camp a bit farther down the trail, away from whatever had left that doll in our clearing. We packed quickly, our flashlights casting wild shadows as we made our way through the trees. The silence was thick, broken only by our hurried footsteps, but just as we reached a spot that felt safe, I glanced back down the trail. There, at the edge of the firelight, was the doll. It was standing upright, leaning against a tree, facing us directly. Its remaining eye gleamed in the darkness, watching as we froze in horror. And then it moved. The doll raised one arm, reaching out toward us, and that gravelly voice filled the night air again, but louder this time, more urgent. "Come back." We didn't wait to see what happened next. We ran, stumbling through the underbrush, not stopping until we reached the road. None of us ever spoke about that night again, but sometimes, when I'm alone in my room, I can still hear that whisper, "Let me in." I've never been one to believe in things that go bump in the night. Ghost stories, strange noises, and eerie happenings. They've always been things I laughed off, shrugged at, or chalked up to the wind or some animal rustling around in the trees. That changed the weekend, my friends, and I decided to camp in a secluded area deep in the woods. It was early autumn, the air crisp with that first bite of cold. We picked the spot because it was far from the usual trails, tucked between two ridges where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely made it to the forest floor. Perfect for a weekend away, or so we thought. The first night was peaceful enough. We set up our tents, got a fire going, and spent hours talking and laughing. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air as the evening shadows grew longer. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the more remote it felt, and though we joked about how alone we were, there was an odd feeling of unease that hung in the air. We brushed it off, of course, the typical chatter of, "It's just the woods, and nothing's out here." But as we lay in our tents that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified in the stillness. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt too deliberate, too close. I tried to ignore it, but my heart raced with each strange noise. I must have dozed off eventually, though I kept waking in the dark, listening, waiting for the next sound. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching the dry leaves outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure if the others were awake, but I could hear a faint rustling in their tents, as if they'd heard it too. The footsteps circled my tent, pausing for what felt like minutes at a time. I reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling, but before I could move, a voice rang out from the darkness. "Get out here." It was faint, but clear. A low, gravelly voice that sounded almost like it was coming from under the ground. I gripped the flashlight harder, my pulse pounding in my ears. We had come far into the woods, far enough that no one should be out there. At this hour. Not near us. I waited for a response from my friends, but the camp was unnervingly quiet. The footsteps resumed, but now they sounded closer, much too close. I felt my skin crawl as they circled the tent again, stopping directly at the entrance. I couldn't stay there any longer. I unzipped the flap of the tent, and for a split second, I saw something, a dark shape, hunched low, standing in the distance just beyond the circle of firelight. It was tall, but unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch out from its body in odd angles. I froze, barely daring to breathe, watching the shape shift slightly as though it were moving in the shadows. I jumped to my feet and yanked my friends out of their tents, whispering urgently, "We need to go, now." They were disoriented, but we gathered what little we could and bolted toward the trail. The forest felt alive with sounds now. The wind seemed to howl, and branches cracked underfoot like they were being crushed. Every step we took felt like something was just behind us, getting closer. But when we dared look back, we saw nothing. The shape I had seen was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods, where the trees finally started to thin. We made it to the clearing, gasping for air, hearts racing in the moonlight. But, as we caught our breath and tried to calm down, we noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh ones leading toward our campsite from the very spot where the strange footsteps had been earlier. They weren't animal tracks, but human, barefoot, and they were deep, like someone had been standing there for hours. But here's the thing that made my stomach drop. When we checked our tents, everything was exactly as we had left it. Nothing was disturbed. Our gear, our bags, even the food we had left out was untouched. It was as if whoever or whatever had followed us hadn't been there at all. We packed up in silence, all of us eager to get as far from that spot as possible. No one spoke a word about the strange footprints until much later. We never went back to that area, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't laugh off the idea that something was out there, something waiting. Years later, I came across an old map of the area. It was an archived map that marked the trail we had used. But what made my skin crawl was the label on the spot we had camped. It wasn't marked as a campsite or a trailhead. Instead, it was simply labeled, "Do not enter." It was as though someone knew. A few months ago, my friends and I decided to go on a weekend camping trip. We picked a remote spot deep in the woods, away from the usual crowded campsites. The idea was simple: get some fresh air, disconnect, and enjoy the quiet beauty of nature. But from the moment we arrived, something about the place felt off. The trees were thick, and the air was unnaturally still. No birds, no whine, just silence. We shrugged it off as a normal part of the wilderness and set up our tents. The forest around us seemed untouched, ancient even. The ground was soft, damp with moss, and the only sounds came from the occasional snap of a twig underfoot as we explored. That night, after we cooked our dinner, we gathered around the fire, telling stories and laughing. The fire crackled loudly, but beyond its reach, the darkness was impenetrable. It was unsettling. My friends noticed it too, but none of us wanted to admit it. After a few beers, we agreed to head to our tents to sleep. I was the last one to crawl into my tent, the sound of my zipper feeling too loud in the silence. The night was heavy. I lay there, trying to fall asleep, but the quiet gnawed at me. Then, faintly, I heard something, a soft shuffle, like footsteps on the forest floor. I froze. It was far too soft to be an animal. I slowly unzipped my tent and peeked outside, scanning the darkness. Nothing, just trees and the distant glow of the fire. I told myself I was imagining things and zipped the tent back up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to every rustle, every sigh of the wind through the branches. Hours passed. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again, closer this time. A distinct shuffle, followed by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. My heart pounded as I listened, trying to make sense of it. The whisper sounded like words, but I couldn't make them out. I lay there, terrified, holding my breath. The whisper came again, louder this time, and I could hear it clearly. "Get out," it said. I froze, barely daring to breathe. I thought maybe it was one of my friends playing a joke, but no one had moved, and the tents were eerily still. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shined it into the night. Nothing, just the trees swaying, casting long shadows in the dim light. My heart raced as I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. I stepped out of the tent, my flashlight trembling in my hands, and called out to my friends. No answer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong, and I wasn't alone. I heard the shuffle again, followed by another whisper, but this time, it wasn't from the trees. It came from the direction of my friends' tents. Help? I immediately ran toward their tents, yelling their names. They quickly emerged, looking disoriented and confused. We gathered in a circle, nervously scanning the woods. That's when we heard it again, this time unmistakably close. "Get out." We weren't sure what to do. So, we quickly packed up and decided to leave the area. But, as we gathered our things, we noticed something strange. In the dirt near the fire pit were tracks. Deep, heavy footprints, much too large to belong to any of us. They led into the woods, right toward the area where we had been hearing the whispers. We stood there, paralyzed with fear. The tracks weren't just in one direction, they circled our campsite, as if something had been moving around us all night. One of my friends, desperate to make sense of it, grabbed his phone and checked the GPS, but when he tried to pull up the map, his phone's screen flickered and went black. No signal, no connection. It was as if the forest was blocking us out, cutting us off from the outside world. Without saying another word, we grabbed our bags and hurried back toward the trailhead. As we moved, I couldn't help but feel eyes on us, the weight of the woods pressing in. The whispers didn't stop, they followed us, getting louder, more frantic. Finally, after what felt like hours of rushing through the woods, we made it to the road. We collapsed by the car, gasping for breath. The night was silent once again, as though nothing had ever happened. We drove away without looking back, and none of us spoke a word until we were well out of the woods. It wasn't until later, when we were looking through the photos from the trip, that we realized something that made my blood run cold. In one of the pictures, taken just before we packed up to leave, there was a face. It was faint, hidden in the trees behind us, staring directly at the camera. It had no eyes, just dark, hollow sockets. We didn't go back to those woods, and we never will, but the whispers haven't stopped. They're still there, sometimes when I'm alone, always saying the same thing: get out. I've been hiking in the woods countless times, But there's one trip I'll never forget. It was meant to be a peaceful weekend getaway, nothing more than a few friends and me heading into a dense patch of forest to escape the city's noise and chaos. We picked an isolated area, far off the usual trails, where the trees grew thick, the underbrush dense, and the air smelled of earth and pine. We arrived in the afternoon, setting up camp in a small clearing. The sun was still high, and we joked about the spooky stories we'd heard from other hikers. But as evening drew closer, something in the air began to change. The forest felt alive, but not in the way it should. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker, the wind quieter. The air grew thicker with each passing our dot. By nightfall. We had the campfire crackling in the middle of our small circle. We roasted marshmallows and told stories, the warmth from the flames making us feel safe. Then, the noise came at first. It was subtle, a soft scraping sound from the trees. We paused, staring into the darkness just beyond the fire's light. What was that? One of my friends asked. We all stood still, straining to hear. Nothing. I figured it was just the wind, brushing against the branches. But then it came again, louder this time, a scratch, followed by a soft rustle, like something moving through the leaves. We all exchanged uneasy looks. Maybe it's an animal, I said, though even I wasn't convinced. After a few moments of tense silence, we all tried to go back to our conversation, but the atmosphere had shifted. The forest felt heavier, like something was watching us. It was around this time that I noticed a strange smell, something sour and sharp, like decaying meat. My stomach twisted, but I didn't say anything. It was probably just the smell of wet leaves or something else in the woods. We turned in for the night, all of us retreating to our tents, the sound of the fire still crackling behind us. I zipped my tent shut, trying to shake off the growing unease. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't ignore the noises around me. The scraping continued, closer now, like something was circling the campsite. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but every time I heard it, it was followed by a strange thud, something large hitting the ground, maybe a branch falling. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself I was just imagining things, but the noises weren't stopping. They were growing more deliberate, closer. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a voice. "Don't look." The whisper was soft but clear, and it came from the darkness outside my tent. I sat up, wide-eyed, my breath caught in my throat. I was too scared to move, too scared to even call out to my friends. All I could do was listen. The voice repeated itself. "Don't look." Suddenly, there was a loud bang, like a fist slamming into the side of my tent. I jumped, my heart racing, but I couldn't bring myself to open the zipper. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight, desperately trying to steady myself. Then, I heard the voice again, but this time it was closer, so close that I felt its breath against the fabric of my tent. "Don't look. Please." I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent, shining my flashlight into the forest. The beam of light swept across the trees, the clearing, but there was nothing. I scanned the area, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing moved. Everything was still. I stepped out of the tent cautiously, my eyes darting around the dark woods. My friends were all up now, standing in their tents, faces pale in the dim light of their flashlights. "What is going on?" one of them asked, his voice shaky. "Something's out there," I said, pointing toward the woods. I heard it. We all stood there, motionless, listening. There was a tense silence before the voice came again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't a whisper, it was a loud, guttural growl, right behind me. I spun around, but nothing was there. Just the thick trees and the inky blackness beyond the circle of our flashlights. "Run," I gasped, panic rising in my throat. We didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed our things and sprinted down the trail, not stopping until we reached the car. We didn't speak the whole way back to town, each of us too shaken to say anything. The next morning, we returned to the spot to see if we could figure out what had happened. We found no trace of anything unusual. No tracks, no signs of an animal, nothing, but there was something else. In the clearing where we had camped, there were 3 trees, side by side, with strange marks carved into the bark. They were deep, jagged slashes, almost like claw marks, and they looked fresh. But the most unsettling part, each of the marks was arranged in the shape of an eye. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, Just me and my friends getting away from the chaos of everyday life. We had all agreed on a remote camping spot deep in the woods, a place that was far from any hiking trails and even farther from the nearest ranger station. It was meant to be the perfect escape. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun still hanging low in the sky. The trees here were dense, the canopy thick enough to block out much of the light. We set up camp quickly, unpacking our gear and starting a fire as dusk settled in. The sound of the crackling fire was comforting, and for a while, everything felt normal. We joked and laughed, swapping stories and trying to ignore the growing sense of isolation the deep woods seemed to encourage. But as night fully descended, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. No animals, no rustling of leaves, no distant sounds of water, just an unnatural stillness. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that it was just the remoteness of the area, that everything would be fine. Then we heard it, a low, deep thud, almost like something heavy dropping to the ground. It came from the woods. Beyond the firelight, we all froze. My stomach twisted as I scanned the dark line of trees, unable to see anything through the thick underbrush. "It's probably an animal," one of my friends suggested, but his voice trembled. I couldn't argue with him. It had to be an animal, right? We tried to laugh it off, but the unease lingered. A few minutes later, another thud, this time louder, closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at my friends, but they were just as tense as I was. "Maybe we should check it out," one of them suggested, though he clearly wasn't as eager as his words implied. We all stared at the trees, now far darker than before. Something about it didn't feel right. We decided to investigate, against our better judgment. With flashlights in hand, we stepped into the woods, the beam cutting through the dark, our steps cautious. The air was unnervingly still, the only sounds the crunch of dry leaves beneath our boots. Then it happened. From behind a thick cluster of trees, something shot out at us, a flash of motion, quick and too fast to be anything natural. We screamed and scattered, the beam of my flashlight flickering wildly as I turned in every direction, my heart racing. I couldn't see anything but shadows. "Did you see that?" someone shouted. "I don't know," I stammered, panic bubbling up inside me. My breath came in short gasps, my mind racing. We huddled together, trying to calm ourselves, but the air felt thick with something I couldn't describe. My mind kept replaying what I had seen, a figure, but not like any animal, too tall, too thin. It seemed to vanish as soon as the light hit it. We headed back to camp quickly, our hearts still pounding in our chests. Once there, we all stayed silent, the fire crackling louder than it should. We avoided looking at each other, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the unease sinking deeper into our bones. Then, the noise came again. This time it wasn't a thud. It was a soft scraping sound, like something or someone dragging across the ground. My stomach lurched. It came from the trees again, but closer, too close. We all jumped to our feet, shining our flashlights toward the noise, but nothing. The woods were silent once more. That's when it hit me, there was something wrong. We weren't alone. Suddenly, the bushes near the edge of our camp rustled violently. I jumped back, my flashlight flicking erratically as I spun to face it. The noise came again, closer, as if something was right there, just beyond the reach of the light. My heart raced in my chest as I backed away, but I didn't want to be the first to run. We stood frozen, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. No movement, no sound, just a heavy silence that pressed down on us. I was about to call out when the ground under my feet shifted. I stumbled back, my flashlight cutting across the ground just in time to catch something strange, a mark. A large, wide indent in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged across the earth. That's when I realized the true horror. It wasn't just one thing in the woods. It was everywhere. I turned, eyes wide, and scanned the trees again. And that's when I saw it, to glowing eyes, set deep in the shadows. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too still. We didn't wait. We packed up everything in a frenzy, my hands shaking as I tossed things into my backpack. We rushed to the car, not even pausing to check if anything was following us. The entire drive home, none of us spoke. We couldn't explain what had happened, but we all felt it. Whatever was out there in the woods, watching us, had been waiting for something, and we had gotten too close. A group of us decided to escape the stress of city life and go camping in the woods. We were all seasoned campers, so the plan was straightforward: hike deep into the forest, set up camp, and enjoy the serenity away from everything. We left early on Saturday morning, eager to disconnect from the world. The forest was dense, the kind of place where sunlight barely reaches the forest floor. As we hiked in, the air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around us. The path narrowed, and the only sound was our footsteps crunching through the underbrush. There was something eerie about it, but none of us said anything. We were too excited to let our nerves get the best of us. By the time we found a clearing, the sun was beginning to set. We set up camp quickly, gathering wood for a fire. The wind picked up, whistling through the branches, sending shivers down my spine. As night fell, the forest seemed to grow even more silent, as if holding its breath. Around the fire, we shared stories and laughed, but there was a strange feeling in the air, an unsettling quietness, like something was watching us. Later, as we crawled into our tents for the night, the mood had shifted. The wind howled outside, rattling the tent walls, but it wasn't the wind that kept me awake. It was the silence. It was too still, too quiet. No night creatures were calling. No rustling in the bushes, just the sound of the wind and the occasional snap of a twig. I finally drifted off, but was jolted awake sometime after midnight. The sound of movement outside my tent made my heart race. It wasn't the wind, or an animal. It was deliberate, slow, like someone was walking around our campsite. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps circled the tent, pausing for long moments, as if the person or thing was studying us. My throat went dry. I grabbed my flashlight, trying to steady my trembling hands. The beam flickered as I unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. I saw nothing, just the dark shapes of trees and the low glow of the fire, now reduced to embers. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I pulled the flap back, fully unzipping it. My friends were still in their tents, sound asleep, blissfully unaware of the strange presence surrounding us. I stepped out cautiously, my feet crunching on the frost-covered ground. My flashlight scanned the area, but again, there was nothing. I stood there, trying to convince myself it was nothing, when I heard it. A voice, faint and distant. Don single quotes T. Look. My stomach lurched. The voice wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, and it had come from the direction of the tree line. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I froze. I should have gone back into my tent, woken my friends, but something kept me rooted in place. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadows. Suddenly, the air around me seemed to grow colder, the darkness thicker. I spun around, my flashlight swinging wildly, but all I saw was the same stillness. Then I heard it again, clearer this time. Don't look. I jerked my head toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. In the space between two trees, something was moving. Something tall, too tall, standing still and just watching. My heart slammed against my chest. It was a figure, unnaturally thin and impossibly long, almost like it was too tall to be human. I could barely make out its features, but there was no mistaking it. It was real. I stumbled back, adrenaline flooding my veins, and rushed back to my tent. I zipped it up as fast as I could, my hands shaking. My friends were still asleep, unaware of what I'd just seen. But as I lay there, trying to calm my breath, I heard something that chilled me to the core. Goodbye. It was the voice again, but this time, it was closer, right outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my ears, praying it was just my imagination. But the voice came again, louder this time. Goodbye. I had to get out. I had to leave. I shook my friends awake, my voice hoarse with fear. We didn't hesitate. We grabbed our gear, packed as quickly as we could, and ran from the campsite, not looking back. We didn't speak much during the hike out, too afraid to even acknowledge what had happened. When we finally reached the car, we didn't stop until we were miles away from that forest. We tried to laugh it off, to convince ourselves that it was just a bad dream. But weeks later, when I was looking through the photos from the trip, I found something strange. In the background of one of the pictures, just past the firelight, was a figure, tall, thin silhouette standing perfectly still between the trees. It was there the whole time. It was supposed to be a typical weekend getaway, just a small group of us venturing into the woods for a peaceful hike. We were far from the usual trails, deep into an area that was barely touched by anyone, with dense trees and a kind of silence that felt unnatural. We set up camp near an old, forgotten trail, with nothing but a few old maps to guide us. The sun dipped low as we built our fire, its flickering light casting long shadows across the clearing. We didn't know it then, but that night would change everything. By the time we finished dinner, the sky was completely dark. The fire crackled, and we sat around it, sharing stories, laughing, and enjoying the isolation. As the night wore on, the woods seemed to grow quieter, heavier. The usual night sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, had stopped. All that remained was the sound of our voices, which now seemed loud against the oppressive silence. At one point, I stepped away from the fire to relieve myself. The forest was so dark that even with the flashlight, the trees seemed to swallow the light whole. As I made my way through the brush, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a sense of being watched, but I told myself it was just the isolation. When I finished and turned back toward the camp, I heard a noise. It was a soft scraping, like something dragging along the ground. My heart skipped. I shone my light around, but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. I quickly made my way back to the fire. When I returned, everyone was still talking, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. The laughter had stopped, and everyone seemed to be glancing nervously toward the woods. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the dark messing with our minds. But then we heard it, a rustling, deeper in the woods than any animal could have made. It wasn't a squirrel or a deer. This was something far heavier, something that wasn't moving in the usual way. My stomach tightened as we all turned toward the sound, eyes wide. Probably just a bear, one of my friends said, but his voice was shaky. We waited, frozen, nothing. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The air felt colder suddenly, and my breath fogged in front of me. The noise stopped, and everything went dead quiet again. Then came the voice. It wasn't a growl or a screech, but a soft, guttural whisper. It came from somewhere behind me, low enough to be barely audible. Leave. My blood ran cold. The others hadn't heard it. They were still looking at the trees, trying to figure out what had made the noise. I felt a cold hand wrap around my spine. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and turned to shine it in the direction of the voice, and I saw it, a figure, barely discernible in the shadows. It was tall and unnaturally still. My heart pounded in my chest as I froze, unable to move. I could see nothing but the silhouette, but the feeling it gave off was suffocating. It was staring right at me, its face hidden in the dark. I didn't know what to do. The others were still oblivious, talking amongst themselves, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, watching. I backed up slowly, moving toward the fire. It wasn't until I had nearly reached the circle of light that it disappeared, slipping back into the woods like smoke. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been very wrong. The rest of the night was a blur. We sat around the fire in silence, no one daring to speak about what had happened. I didn't want to mention what I saw, afraid I'd sound crazy. But the unease lingered, and as the fire burned low, we decided to go to sleep. Though no one slept well, the next morning, we packed up quickly, eager to leave. As we broke down camp, one of my friends stumbled upon something strange, a large, twisted piece of bark. It was fresh, not from the forest around us. But what made it worse was the carving. It was the same symbol we'd seen the night before. A figure, tall, watching. We left immediately after that. No one spoke of it again. But, as we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing by the edge of the woods, barely visible in the trees, was the figure, watching. We all saw it this time, and that was when I realized it wasn't something that had been in the woods at all. It had followed us back. As a park ranger, I had always been drawn to the solitude of the deep woods. The crisp air, the sounds of nature, and the occasional visit from campers made the job rewarding. One particular October evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I received a call over the radio. A family had set up camp near a remote area, and they were anxious about strange noises coming from the woods. I assured them I would investigate and headed out with my flashlight and gear. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the darker it became. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their branches whispering secrets in the wind. I found the campsite nestled among the pines, a flickering campfire barely illuminating the anxious faces of the family. They were huddled close together, their expressions a mix of fear and concern. I asked what they had heard, and the father, his voice trembling, described a low growl and snapping branches echoing from the woods. The mother clutched her children, eyes wide with terror. I promised to check the perimeter and reassured them that it was likely just a bear or some other wildlife. The family nodded but remained visibly shaken. As I walked beyond their camp, the forest felt alive, each rustle amplifying my anxiety. I swept my flashlight across the darkened trees, scanning for movement. The growling had subsided, replaced by an eerie silence that set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After about 20 minutes of searching, I returned to the family. They looked relieved to see me, but were still on high alert. I suggested they stay close to the fire and try to get some rest while I kept watch. I positioned myself a few yards from their tent, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. As the hours passed, the silence was punctuated by the occasional crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl. Then, just as I began to relax, I heard it again, a low growl, deeper this time, resonating through the trees. My heart raced as I shined my flashlight toward the sound, illuminating nothing but the shadows of the forest. I took a deep breath and walked toward the sound, my senses heightened. The growl was now accompanied by snapping twigs. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing an unsettling sight. A tall figure stood at the edge of the trees, its outline indistinct. It looked almost human, but something was wrong. It was too tall, too slender, and it didn't move like a person. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response came, just a low growl that echoed back to me. Suddenly, the figure lunged toward me, and I stumbled backward, the beam of my flashlight flickering as I tripped over a root. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and ran back to the camp. The family was awake, eyes wide with fear. I told them to pack their things quickly, whatever it was in the woods. I could feel it was not friendly. They hurriedly stuffed their belongings into their bags, their hands trembling. As they finished, I led them to the path back to my truck, keeping my flashlight trained on the darkened trees. Just as we reached the trailhead, the air grew cold, and I turned back to glance at the woods. The figure stood just beyond the tree line, watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine, but pushed the family forward. We hurried to the truck, and I fumbled for the keys, my fingers shaking. Just as I got the door open, a loud crash echoed from the forest, followed by a terrifying roar. I threw the family inside and slammed the door. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated the edge of the woods, revealing the figure again, closer this time, its face twisted in a grotesque grin. I backed out and drove away as fast as I could. The family was silent, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. Finally, I turned to them and asked if they had seen anything. They exchanged confused looks, and then began to speak. The father insisted he had seen the figure, but the children only remembered shadows. The mother looked at me, her eyes wide. Then she pointed to the back of the truck. I turned, and my stomach dropped. There was a face pressed against the window, twisted and contorted, mirroring the grotesque smile I had seen earlier. The moment my heart stopped, the face vanished, leaving only the darkness behind. We all sat in stunned silence, realizing that whatever had been watching us was still out there, lingering just beyond the reach of our light. A few friends and I packed our tents, sleeping bags, and a few essentials, and hiked deep into a forest that was far from any well-traveled trails. The sun was just beginning to dip below the trees when we set up camp in a clearing. The air smelled of fresh pine, and the sound of birds and rustling leaves filled the space around us. As we got the fire going, everything felt right. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where worries disappeared. By nightfall, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and chatting. The forest felt alive with the sounds of night creatures, but there was an eerie stillness in the air, like something was watching us. I brushed it off as nothing more than my imagination, but I wasn't the only one who noticed it. My friend Sarah was staring into the woods, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, half joking. She shook her head. I don't know. It just feels strange. I laughed it off. It's just the forest. You're fine. We all tried to brush it off, but none of us felt entirely at ease. As the fire burned low, we decided to call it a night and crawl into our tents. I was the last one to settle in, zip my tent shut, and lie down, trying to push the nagging feeling away. It wasn't long before I heard the first noise. It was faint, like something brushing against the canvas of my tent. I froze, listening intently. Nothing. The wind. Probably, but then it came again, this time louder. Something was scraping along the side of my tent. I gripped the flashlight by my side, trying not to make a sound. I knew we weren't in bear country, and the thought of a person outside my tent sent a cold shiver down my spine. The noise came again. It was deliberate, slow, not an animal. My breath caught in my throat as the sound of something footsteps crunched in the leaves just outside. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The rustling got closer, right by my head. Then there was a whisper. "Don't open the door." I felt my heart skip a beat. The voice was clear, as if someone was standing right outside. It wasn't one of my friends. I knew that. I reached for the zipper of my tent, my hand trembling, and pulled it open just enough to slip the flashlight through. Nothing. The clearing was empty. I stared out into the darkness, my eyes scanning the trees, but there was no one. I felt like I was losing my mind. "Sarah," I whispered, not wanting to wake the others. "You okay?" The voice answered, distant but loud enough to hear. "Don't open the door, please." I froze, feeling my blood run cold. That wasn't Sarah. That wasn't anyone I knew. I reached for my phone. Dead. I couldn't even text anyone. Panic gripped me as the voice came again. This time it was more insistent, urgent. "You're not alone." I unzipped the tent all the way this time and stepped out, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, shadows flickering in the light. My pulse was racing, and I was on edge, every noise amplifying in my ears. Suddenly, a figure darted across the firelight. I snapped the beam of the flashlight in that direction. Nothing, just the wind, or maybe a raccoon. I turned back to the fire pit, where my friends were still sleeping soundly. I wanted to wake them, but something stopped me. I couldn't explain it. My mind screamed at me to wake them up, but I stayed frozen. Something wasn't right. I could feel the oppressive weight of something just beyond the trees. I sat back down on the log, trying to calm myself. Then, a loud crack split the night air. It came from behind me, and I whipped around, shining the light in that direction. There, standing just beyond the ring of firelight, was a tall, thin figure. My breath caught in my throat, my hand shaking as I lifted the flashlight. But when I looked again, it was gone. I stood up slowly, heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw the unmistakable outline of something in the darkness. It wasn't moving, but it was watching us. I backed toward the tent, every muscle tense. The figure remained where it was, standing perfectly still, just outside the firelight. I rushed into the tent and zipped it up, feeling the cold sweat on my neck. The voice came again, softer this time, almost like a whisper in the wind. "You should have left when you had the chance." We packed up in a hurry the next morning, our nerves shattered. As we hiked back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. I glanced over my shoulder several times, but there was nothing. Weeks later, I went through the pictures on my camera. There was one I didn't remember, taking a blurry shot of the forest, with what looked like a figure standing far behind the trees. But what made my skin crawl was the face I could barely make out in the dark. The face wasn't human. It was watching me. The camping trip started as a way to escape the chaos of city life. My friends and I set off into the wilderness, our spirits high and supplies packed. We found a secluded spot near a lake, surrounded by towering trees. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, laughter echoing through the woods. Yena had brought a deck of cards, and we played games until the stars blanketed the sky. Once the games faded into silence, Matt suggested a night hike. Yena looked hesitant, but was quickly swept up in the excitement. I had always loved the woods, so I was all in. As we made our way down a narrow path, the moonlight filtered through the trees, creating an ethereal glow. The air was crisp, and the sounds of nature surrounded us. But then we heard something, a faint rustling, that made me stop in my tracks. I brushed it off as the wind and continued walking, though an unsettling feeling settled in my stomach. We pressed on, deeper into the woods, but the sense of unease lingered. Just when I thought we'd enjoy a peaceful walk, a loud snap echoed in the stillness. It sounded like a branch breaking, but the sound was too close for comfort. Gina's eyes widened, and she whispered that we should go back. But before we could turn around, we caught sight of something moving in the distance. A figure was partially illuminated by the moonlight, standing still among the trees. It looked human, but was too far away to see clearly. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I took a step forward, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and fear. But the moment I did, the figure suddenly darted behind a tree. It was quick and too agile for comfort. My instincts screamed to get back to camp, but curiosity got the better of me. I urged my friends to follow, and we moved cautiously toward the area where we'd seen the figure. As we got closer, the air felt heavier, almost electric. I shone my flashlight around, but the woods seemed to swallow the light. The figure was gone. My friends exchanged nervous glances, and the laughter we shared earlier faded into a tense silence. Just then, I heard a faint whisper, a voice that sent chills up my spine. "Help me." We froze, hearts pounding, searching for the source of the voice. It sounded desperate and distant, echoing through the trees. Yena gripped my arm tightly, and we all turned in unison toward the sound, which seemed to draw us deeper into the woods. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it was unmistakably human. "Help me." Compelled by a mix of fear and concern, I led the group further into the darkness, following the voice that begged for help. As we walked, the whispering intensified, morphing into frantic cries. The air grew colder, and shadows danced menacingly around us. Suddenly, we reached a clearing. In the center stood a decrepit old cabin, the kind you only see in horror movies. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar. The cries for help echoed from inside, now sounding almost pleading. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I couldn't turn back. We had to see what was going on. We approached cautiously, the floorboards creaking under our feet as we stepped inside. The air was stale, and the smell of decay filled the space. The cries for help were now frantic, almost desperate. I felt a pull, as if something was urging me to go deeper into the cabin. My friends hung back, uncertainty etched on their faces. Then, as I turned to look into one of the dark rooms, the door slammed shut behind me. My heart raced, and I whirled around, panic rising. The cries turned into laughter, echoing around me. It was a sinister, mocking sound that sent waves of dread through my body. I pounded on the door, yelling for my friends. The door creaked open, and I stumbled back into the clearing, breathless. My friends stood there, eyes wide with fear. They hadn't heard any cries. They hadn't heard anything. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence that blanketed the area. I felt my stomach drop as realization hit. We had followed a voice that wasn't there, led into a trap we could barely comprehend. We turned to run back to camp, hearts racing, adrenaline pumping. We didn't stop until we reached the lake. The moonlight illuminated our campsite, and the fire still flickered weakly. But when we arrived, we froze in horror. Our gear was scattered, the tent torn apart. In the center of the camp was a message carved into the ground with something dark and sticky. "Thanks for playing." Panic set in, and we grabbed what we could. We didn't speak, didn't look back. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding. The last thing I saw was the cabin, standing silent and foreboding, the laughter echoing in my mind. We never spoke of that night again, but sometimes I still hear the whispers, drawing me back to the woods. Just a few friends heading into the woods for a weekend of hiking, campfires, and stargazing. We had chosen a remote spot deep in the forest, far from the usual tourist trails. The kind of place you only find if you're looking for it, and where the only sounds are the wind and the birds. We arrived just before dusk, the air thick with the scent of pine. It was beautiful, calm, and entirely untouched. We set up camp near a clearing. There was a small creek running through it, its water dark and swift. We didn't think much of it at first. We were laughing, unpacking, and excited to get the fire going. Everything felt normal, even peaceful, As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The fire crackled, casting long, flickering shadows on the trees around us. After a while, we noticed something strange. The woods, which had been so quiet earlier, seemed to quiet now. The usual sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, had vanished. It was unsettling, the way the night felt so unnaturally still. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing. But my friends noticed it too, and the unease grew. We huddled closer to the fire, exchanging nervous jokes to try and lighten the mood. But no one really felt like laughing anymore. That's when we heard the first noise. It came from deeper in the woods, the sound of twigs snapping underfoot, deliberate and slow. It was too regular, too rhythmic, as though something was pacing around the perimeter of our camp. We froze, staring at each other, unsure of what to do. At first, we thought it might be an animal, but this didn't feel like the movement of any creature we knew. The noise stopped, and for a few moments, all we could hear was the crackling of the fire and our own breaths. Then, a voice. It was faint but distinct, just on the edge of hearing, like it was coming from somewhere beyond the firelight. Leave. The word was soft, almost a whisper, but it was clear. We all looked at each other, our faces pale under the flickering light. None of us had spoken. It wasn't one of us. One of my friends, the most practical among us, grabbed his flashlight and stood up. "I'll check it out," he said, trying to sound brave. But his voice was shaking, and we all knew he was scared. We followed him, though none of us wanted to. We walked to the edge of the clearing, where the trees grew thick and dark. The beam of the flashlight swept over the forest floor, catching only shadows and the occasional glint of something reflective eyes. Maybe, but we couldn't be sure. The air felt heavy, thick, like it was pressing down on us. Then, the flashlight flickered and died. Panic set in immediately. We all pulled out our phones, but of course, there was no signal. It felt like the forest was swallowing us whole. I wanted to turn back, but something kept me frozen. The silence returned. Then came the whisper again, clearer this time, as if it was directly behind us. "Leave." Now, we spun around, our hearts racing, but there was nothing there. Just trees, just the night. We didn't stay long after that. We packed up quickly, more frantic than I'd ever seen any of us. The hike back to the car was silent, the eerie feeling of being watched never leaving us. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush made our hearts skip a beat. We didn't stop until we reached the car, where we drove straight back to civilization. We didn't talk about it much afterward. None of us really wanted to. We told ourselves it had just been our imaginations running wild, that it was all just nerves and the dark playing tricks on us. But I know what I heard. A week later, I received a message from one of my friends. It was a picture, a blurry image of a tree. But in the corner, barely visible, was a figure, tall, shadowy shape, standing in the same spot where we'd heard the whispering. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the figure in the photo was facing the camera, and in the place where its face should have been, there was nothing, just empty space. It started as a simple weekend getaway with a few friends. We had all been craving a break from the city. So, we decided to camp deep in the woods, far from any marked trails. No one had been there before, but the spot looked perfect on the map, secluded, peaceful, and surrounded by towering pines. We were ready for adventure. We arrived around noon, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. Setting up camp took only a couple of hours, and by the time the sun began to set, the campfire crackled between us, casting long shadows on the ground. We joked around, ate, and made plans for a short hike the next morning. The air was crisp, and everything felt normal. Then, as night fell, the forest seemed to change. The wind picked up, and the trees began to groan. It wasn't a particularly unsettling sound, but it felt wrong. Somehow, like the wind was trying to say something. I brushed it off, attributing it to the wilderness being what it is, alive, unpredictable. We huddled closer to the fire as it burned low, the darkness pressing in around us. It wasn't until the first strange sound that I started to feel uneasy. A loud crack, like something heavy snapping, echoed from the tree line. It wasn't a branch falling. It was too forceful, too deliberate. We all went silent, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. There were no animals in the area that sounded like that, at least none we knew of, probably just a deer, someone suggested, though none of us believed it. A second crack followed. Closer this time. We stayed quiet, listening. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was out there. Maybe we should go to bed, I said, trying to sound calm. We'll hike in the morning. But no one moved. Everyone stayed stiff, eyes darting around, clearly unsettled. We decided to put out the fire early and retire to our tents, though none of us were eager to sleep. The wind howled through the trees, and as I lay in my sleeping bag, the sounds outside grew louder, more persistent. The scratching against the tent fabric started softly, like wind brushing over it, but then it intensified. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like something or someone was pressing against the side of the tent. I sat up, heart racing. I wasn't sure what was more terrifying, the thought of an animal or the idea that someone was out there. I didn't want to check, but the scratching grew louder, more urgent. Finally, I couldn't take it. I unzipped the tent slowly, holding my breath. The beam from my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees, shadows, and the twisted shapes of branches, but the scratching didn't stop. It continued, as if whatever was outside the tent was toying with me. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a soft, barely audible whisper. "Don't look." My blood ran cold. I slammed the tent shut and laid down again, trying to calm my frantic heart. The whisper repeated, louder this time, "Don't look." I sat frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had no idea what was happening. The whisper sounded close, too close, like someone was standing right next to my tent. But when I dared to peek outside again, there was nothing. I wasn't the only one who had heard it. When I glanced over at the others, I saw they were awake, staring at me with wide eyes. No one spoke, but we all understood. Something was wrong. We decided to leave, pack up, and get out of there. As we gathered our things in the dark, the whispers returned, echoing through the trees. But this time, there was something more. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching us from the tree line. I grabbed my pack and ran toward the path, my friends following behind me. We didn't stop until we reached the car. As we pulled out of the clearing and back onto the road, the whispers followed us, growing fainter as we drove farther away. It wasn't until we were nearly an hour away from the campsite that I glanced at my phone and noticed something strange. Several photos on my camera roll, taken during the night. I didn't recognize them. They were blurry, distorted, but one stood out, a picture of our campfire, with a shadowy figure standing just beyond the tree line. It wasn't one of us. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its face obscured by the darkness, but its eyes, there were no eyes, just black sockets staring back. The worst part, the photo had been taken at the exact moment we'd heard the whisper. "Don't look." We'd survived the night, but whatever had been watching us, it was still there, waiting. The evening sun was sinking below the horizon as I patrolled the forest trails, the fading light casting long shadows between the trees. As a park ranger, I had learned to love the isolation and beauty of the deep woods, but tonight felt different. The chill in the air hinted at an approaching storm, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Around dusk, I received a call on the radio about a family camping a few miles from my current position. They reported strange noises surrounding their tent. The mother sounded terrified, insisting it was something big prowling just beyond their campsite. I assured her I would head over immediately. After a quick check of my gear, I set off down the narrow trail. The deeper I walked into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees loomed overhead, blocking out what little light remained. My flashlight illuminated only a few feet ahead, and the darkness seemed to swallow the beams whole. As I trekked onward, the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I kept my radio on, hoping to stay in touch with the family as I approached. When I reached their campsite, the first thing I noticed was the stillness. The family's tent was pitched in a small clearing, but there were no signs of life. My heart raced as I called out to them. Silence enveloped me, thick and heavy. I stepped closer and peered inside the tent, but it was empty. The sleeping bags lay undisturbed, and the gear was neatly packed. Something twisted in my gut as I wondered where they could be. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the trees nearby. I jumped, spinning around with my flashlight aimed into the darkness. The beam caught a glimpse of movement, a dark shape darting between the trees. Adrenaline surged through me. I yelled for the family, hoping they would respond, but only the wind answered. I decided to check the surrounding area. I took a few steps into the trees when I heard it, a low growl, rumbling and guttural. It sent chills down my spine. I felt like prey in a predator's territory. I called again, my voice trembling, but there was still no response. I was alone. The growling grew louder, closer. I turned to run back to the clearing, but I stumbled over a root and fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flew from my hand, clattering away into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet and frantically searched for the light. As I reached for it, I felt something brush against my arm. Panic gripped me, and I recoiled, heart racing. The flashlight flickered back to life in my hand, and as I turned, I saw it. A massive creature stood just a few feet away, its eyes reflecting the light like two glowing coals. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long. A deep growl emanated from its throat, vibrating in the air around me. My instincts screamed at me to flee, but I was frozen in place. Then, without warning, the creature lunged toward me. I ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding its grasp. I sprinted back to the tent, desperately calling for the family as I ran. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me. My lungs burned, but I pushed forward, desperate to reach safety. I burst into the clearing, and to my shock, I found the family emerging from the trees, their faces pale and wide-eyed. They looked like they had been running too. I quickly waved them over and led them back to their tent. We huddled together, and I explained what I had seen. Just then, we heard the growl again, closer this time. We scrambled into the tent, my heart pounding as I pulled the flap shut. The creature's claws scraped against the tent fabric, and I felt its weight pressing against the structure. It felt like it was toying with us, waiting for us to show ourselves. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the creature stopped. Silence enveloped us. We waited, holding our breath, unsure of what to expect. After a long moment, the family's youngest child whispered, "Where did it go?" I took a deep breath and slowly opened the tent flap. Peering out, the clearing was empty. The creature had vanished. As we stumbled out into the moonlight, I noticed something strange on the ground, a footprint, but not a normal one. It was human-sized and oddly shaped, as if someone had been standing there all along. I turned to the family, and their faces mirrored my shock. What had chased us? Where had it gone? We looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between us. The true horror of the night was not the creature itself, but the fact that it could take on the form of a human. It could be anyone, lurking in the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting group to stumble upon its domain. I never expected my job as a park ranger to take such a terrifying turn. It was mid-autumn, and I was patrolling the deep woods that had grown dark and ominous with the season. The air was crisp, leaves crunched beneath my boots, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting eerie shadows among the trees. I was on my usual route, ensuring the trails were clear for any late-season campers. Around dusk, I received a call from a group of campers who reported strange noises near their campsite. They described it as a low growl mixed with something like human whispers. At first, I thought it might be a bear or perhaps the wind playing tricks on them, but their fear was palpable over the radio. I decided to head out and check on them. As I made my way through the thickening underbrush, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I dismissed it as nerves. After all, I had patrolled these woods countless times. I reached their campsite just as twilight faded into night. The fire was dying down, and the campers huddled around it, wide-eyed and trembling. They explained that the sounds had started shortly after sunset, echoing from the tree line. They insisted it felt like something was lurking just out of sight. I tried to calm them, suggesting it was probably just wildlife. But, as we sat around the fire, the noises began again, a low growl followed by the faintest of whispers that seemed to slither through the air. "Did you hear that?" One of the campers gasped. I nodded, my heart racing. This was more than just wildlife. I instructed everyone to stay close and keep the fire burning. As I scanned the perimeter of the clearing, the shadows began to twist and writhe in a way that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the bushes to my left. I swung my flashlight toward it, and in the beam, I caught a glimpse of something pale and elongated, disappearing behind a tree. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light, but the campers had seen it too. "I don't like this," one of them said, his voice trembling. "We should leave," I agreed. It felt wrong to stay any longer. As we packed up, the whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a chilling wind. I kept the flashlight aimed into the dark as we walked, trying to ignore the sensations of dread gnawing at me. As we reached the trail, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. I turned, but nothing was there. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I quickened my pace, urging the campers to do the same. The whispers intensified, echoing our fears, the sound growing nearer. Just then, a loud crack echoed through the trees, and we all jumped. I turned around to face the noise. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood a few yards away, its features distorted in the dim light. It had unnaturally long limbs, and its eyes glowed with an unsettling light. The whispers transformed into guttural sounds, incomprehensible but undeniably threatening. Instinct kicked in, and I shouted for everyone to run. We sprinted down the trail, hearts pounding in our chests, the sounds of our panicked breaths mixing with the monstrous growls behind us. We pushed through the thick underbrush, desperate to put distance between us and whatever was chasing us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon a clearing that opened up to the main road. We dashed across, collapsing in a heap on the other side. The woods loomed behind us, dark and silent. The terror suddenly stilled. As we caught our breath, I looked at the campers, trying to reassure them that we were safe now. But then, one of them pointed back toward the woods. My stomach dropped. Emerging from the tree line was not the figure we had encountered, but a group of people in costumes, their faces painted and eyes wide with laughter. It was a Halloween prank gone awry. They had been planning a haunted trail and didn't realize they had scared us off. The whispers we heard were merely their attempts to build suspense. The growls, just a well-placed speaker hidden in the bushes. I felt a mix of relief and annoyance wash over me. We were safe, but the realization left me feeling foolish. Yet even as they explained their prank, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of dread. As I turned back toward the woods, the air felt different, heavier. I saw the shadows shift again, but this time I noticed something more unsettling. In the distance, not far from where the pranksters had emerged, the real figure stood, watching us with those glowing eyes. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my friends. We drove to a secluded area, far from the noise of the city, hoping to escape the pressures of our everyday lives. There were 5 of us, my friends Jake, Sarah, Lily, and Mark. We pitched our tents under the trees, the sound of the crackling fire providing a comforting backdrop to our laughter. As night fell, the woods transformed, the shadows deepened, and the familiar sounds of the forest turned ominous. I suggested we tell ghost stories, thinking it would be a laugh. But as we shared tales of lost souls and wandering spirits, I could feel an unsettling chill creeping in. Jokingly, Jake dared us to go for a midnight hike to explore the woods. With flashlights in hand, we ventured into the darkness. The moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy, and every rustle in the underbrush made my heart race. As we walked deeper, I noticed that the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was watching us. I dismissed the feeling as paranoia, but something about the stillness made me uneasy. That's when we heard a low, mournful howl echoing through the trees. We stopped in our tracks, exchanging nervous glances. Was it a wolf? The sound sent a shiver down my spine. We decided to press on, hoping to laugh it off once we were back at camp. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The howling returned, closer this time, accompanied by a faint rustling. Suddenly, Mark, who had been trailing behind, screamed. We turned to see him pointing toward a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a tall silhouette, swaying slightly, its outline obscured by the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to make out any details. I felt paralyzed, fear gripping me like a vice. "Is that a person?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Before anyone could respond, the figure lurched forward. Panic erupted among us. We turned to run, but my foot snagged on a root, and I fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and stumbled after my friends. We burst back into the clearing, breathless and shaken. I quickly checked to see if everyone was okay. Mark was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What was that thing?" he gasped. "I don't know, but we should pack up and leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We hurriedly gathered our things, our earlier bravado completely forgotten. As we worked, the haunting howl rang out again, echoing in the distance. It felt like the forest itself was alive, mocking our fear. With our gear hastily stuffed into backpacks, we turned to leave when Jake suddenly froze, his eyes wide. "The fire," he said, pointing. The flames had flared up unexpectedly, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. We had extinguished it before heading into the woods, but now it blazed brighter than ever, illuminating the trees around us. "What the hell?" Lily exclaimed. I felt a cold sweat break out as I realized something was off. The firelight revealed a pattern in the dirt around it, something we hadn't seen before. Scratches and markings that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. It looked like words, but twisted, as if they had been clawed into the ground. "Get away from the fire," I yelled, panic rising again. We stumbled backward, eyes locked on the flames. The howls returned, but now they were accompanied by a rustling sound, like branches snapping. Shadows danced wildly around us, the flames illuminating the silhouettes of figures hiding just outside the light's reach. We were trapped. Then, just as we were about to bolt, the fire suddenly died down to embers, plunging us into darkness once more. The figures became clearer now, dozens of them, watching silently from the tree line, their faces obscured by the night. In a flash, I recalled a story I had heard years ago, about a camping group that vanished without a trace, the only clue being markings found in the dirt. They had been lured into the woods by the firelight, just like we had been. In that moment, we understood. We weren't just in a haunted forest. We were part of a sinister game, and we had unknowingly walked into their territory. With adrenaline pumping, we bolted toward the path that led back to our car. As we ran, I could hear their footsteps behind us, almost mocking. I glanced back one last time and saw them emerging from the shadows, eyes glinting like hungry predators. We reached the car, breathless and terrified, and peeled away from the campsite, leaving behind the twisted horror of the woods. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was a figure standing by the dying embers, watching us leave, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time I felt their presence. As a park ranger, I had seen my share of odd things in the deep woods, but nothing prepared me for the night of the storm. It was late October, and the trees had shed most of their leaves, leaving the forest eerily bare. The air felt thick with anticipation as I patrolled the campground, the wind rustling the branches overhead like whispers of a forgotten language. I had just finished my usual rounds when the first raindrops began to fall. I headed back to my truck, ready to ride out the storm. That's when I received the radio call. A family had set up camp in a remote area, and they reported strange noises coming from the woods. Their kids were terrified, and the father asked for someone to check it out. I hesitated. I knew that area was notoriously isolated. Still, I felt a duty to help. With the rain now pouring, I drove as far as I could on the muddy trail, parking a good half-mile from their campsite. The light from my flashlight flickered in the dark, illuminated only by the occasional crack of lightning. I felt an unsettling chill as I walked toward their tent, the wet ground squelching beneath my boots. The sound of rain drowned out the forest sounds, creating an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. Upon reaching the campsite, I called out to them. No answer. I peered into the tent, half expecting to see the family huddled inside. It was empty. The sleeping bags were neatly arranged, their backpacks untouched. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I stepped back, scanning the area, when I heard a low, guttural growl emanating from the nearby thicket. Adrenaline surged through me, but I couldn't abandon my duty. I called out again, asking if anyone was there. Silence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Just as I turned to leave, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and slender, stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows. It didn't look human. The figure stepped closer, and my heart raced as I tried to make out its features. It was all wrong. Tall, limbs elongated, and its skin glistened like wet bark. I stumbled back, my instincts screaming at me to run. but I knew I couldn't leave without confirming the family's safety. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders, and shone my flashlight in its direction. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing not one figure, but several shadows shifting just beyond the trees, their eyes glowing like embers in the night. I felt a rush of panic as I realized they were closing in on me, the growling growing louder. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, a chilling mix of anger and desperation. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the wet ground, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I darted through the trees, branches whipping against my face. I could hear them behind me, their movements swift and unnatural, and I pushed myself to go faster, fueled by sheer terror. As I burst back onto the main trail, the growling ceased. I stopped, panting heavily, glancing back into the woods. The darkness loomed silent, as if nothing had ever been there. I fumbled for my radio, my hands shaking. Just as I was about to call for help, I caught sight of a flicker of movement in the trees. It was then that I saw them. The family I had come to find was standing just at the edge of the clearing, staring at me with wide eyes. They were unharmed, but their faces were pale, their expressions frozen in fear. I rushed over, relief flooding my chest. I asked what had happened. The father shook his head, his voice trembling. They had been hearing strange noises all night, but when they stepped out of the tent to investigate, they saw something in the shadows watching them. They didn't know what it was, but it terrified them into staying inside. As we gathered around my truck, the father suddenly pointed behind me. I turned slowly, dread washing over me. Just beyond the trees stood the figure again, but this time it was smiling, a twisted grin splitting its face. My heart dropped as the realization hit me. It had been playing with us, waiting for the right moment to strike. In that instant, the lights on my truck flickered, and I felt a cold breeze brush against my neck. The family clutched each other, and I could feel my body tense as the air grew thick with malice. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. We had survived for now, but the woods were still alive with something sinister, and we were far from safe. It was a late autumn evening when I began my shift as a park ranger. The air was crisp, and the last vestiges of daylight seeped through the dense canopy of trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I loved this time of year, the vibrant colors, the quiet that enveloped the woods as most campers had already packed up for the season. I took my first stroll down the main trail, making sure everything was in order. About an hour into my rounds, I received a radio call from a family camping near the far end of the park. They reported odd noises outside their tent, sounds that didn't match the usual wildlife. I assured them I would head over immediately. Their campsite was a good hike away, and with each step, I felt the growing tension in the air, as if the woods were holding their breath. By the time I reached their site, the sun had completely vanished. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the clearing. The tent was unzipped, and I called out, but no one answered. I shone my flashlight into the tent. Their belongings were scattered inside, but the family was nowhere to be found. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. That's when I heard a low growl, deep and guttural, reverberating through the trees. It sent a shiver racing up my spine. I turned off my flashlight, straining to hear better. The growl came again, louder, closer. It wasn't a bear. It felt almost human, twisted in some unnatural way. I backed out of the tent slowly, my heart pounding. As I stepped outside, the hairs on my neck stood on end. My flashlight flickered, and I could have sworn I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. I called out for the family, my voice shaky and barely audible. Then, just at the tree line, I saw a figure, tall and thin, partially obscured by darkness. It stood unnaturally still, its head tilted at an odd angle. I felt my pulse quicken. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the creature took a step forward, and I could see its face, or what I thought was a face. It was pale, featureless except for deep, hollow eye sockets. My breath caught in my throat as it let out another growl, echoing through the night. I sprinted back to my vehicle, adrenaline propelling me forward. I fumbled for the radio, trying to call for backup, but the static crackled loudly, making my heart race even faster. I finally managed to get a message out, desperate for someone to respond. I jumped into the truck and locked the doors, staring out into the abyss of trees surrounding me. Moments felt like hours, and I was about to lose hope when another ranger arrived, his headlights cutting through the darkness. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as he stepped out. I quickly explained what I had seen, my words tumbling out in a rush. He listened intently, and as we prepared to search for the family, we heard something, the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing through the trees. Confused, we followed the sound. It led us deeper into the woods, where the trees were so thick I could hardly see. Then we stumbled into a small clearing. There they were, the family, huddled around a small campfire, roasting marshmallows and laughing like nothing was wrong. I felt my heart drop. I rushed toward them, demanding to know where they had been. The father looked at me with a puzzled expression. They had heard the growl, but assumed it was just a bear and decided to wait it out. I was flooded with relief, but something felt off. As we gathered around the fire, I noticed the mother was pale, her hands trembling. She glanced nervously toward the trees. I followed her gaze, and suddenly, the air grew cold. The laughter faded, replaced by a low, haunting growl. The family's faces turned to shock as the figure stepped into the light, its movements slow and deliberate, but then it stopped, hovering at the edge of the firelight. I was sure it would attack, but instead, it turned its head and looked directly at me, those hollow eye sockets boring into my soul. Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the fire flared up brightly, and in that moment, the figure simply vanished. The family stood frozen, their faces white with fear. The growl faded into silence. We all looked at one another, unsure of what had just happened. What was real? Had I imagined the creature? Or had it truly been there? The night ended with us all packed tightly together around the campfire, the eerie silence settling around us like a shroud. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that the woods are not as empty as they seem. I hear whispers in the wind and feel eyes watching me. Whatever was lurking in the shadows that night might not be gone for good. We were excited for our weekend camping trip, the four of us eager to escape the grind of everyday life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, we arrived at our chosen spot. The site was remote, surrounded by dense woods that promised solitude and adventure. We set up our tents, made a campfire, and cooked hot dogs while sharing stories of past trips, laughing under the stars. As night enveloped the forest, a chill set in. We huddled closer to the fire, and Yana, always the jokester, suggested we play a game. She proposed truth or scare, a twist on the classic game. Each person had to tell a scary story or share a truth that no one else knew. It was all in good fun until it was my turn. With the fire crackling and shadows dancing around us, I began to tell the tale of a local legend, an old park ranger who vanished in the woods decades ago. They say he was searching for something he never found, and on moonless nights, you can still hear his chains rattling as he roams, looking for anyone who dares to camp in his territory. As I spoke, I noticed a flicker of unease in my friend's eyes, but I brushed it off, attributing it to the spooky atmosphere. After my story, we decided to take a short hike before bed. The darkness pressed in around us, the trees towering like silent sentinels. We laughed nervously, trying to keep the mood light, but the deeper we ventured into the woods, the more the sounds of nature seemed to fade. It was eerily quiet, and I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Suddenly, from somewhere in the darkness, we heard a distinct clanking sound, like metal against metal. My heart raced as we stopped in our tracks, exchanging worried glances. It echoed through the trees, louder now, like chains being dragged across the ground. Gina's face turned pale, and I could see her grip tightening around the flashlight she held. "Let's get back to camp," I suggested, trying to sound calm. We turned to retrace our steps, but the clanking grew louder, more frantic. Panic surged through us, and we broke into a sprint, the beam of our flashlights bobbing erratically as we stumbled through the underbrush. I could hear my friends gasping behind me, their breaths coming in quick bursts. Then we saw lights, flickering in the distance, moving slowly toward us through the trees. They were lanterns, glowing eerily in the dark. My instinct screamed to run, but curiosity held me in place for a moment too long. I wanted to see what was coming. The lanterns approached, revealing figures shrouded in shadows, their faces obscured by dark hoods. "Hide," I shouted, and we dove into the nearest thicket, hearts pounding in our chests. We crouched low, the clanking chains now deafening. Through the gaps in the bushes, we watched as the figures moved closer, each one carrying a lantern that illuminated their strange, unnatural movements. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. They walked in a slow, deliberate line, each step synchronized, and I could see that they were bound together by chains. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me these weren't just people. They looked like some kind of ghostly procession. As they passed, I caught a glimpse of their faces, hidden behind the hoods but pale and sunken, as if they had emerged from a grave. Then, suddenly, they stopped. One of them turned, their lantern light sweeping across the bushes where we hid. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if sensing our presence, and then continued on, the group moving as one again. We waited, terrified and breathless, until the sounds faded into the distance. When we finally emerged from our hiding place, dawn was breaking, casting a pale light through the trees. We hurried back to camp, shaken but relieved to find our tents untouched. But as we approached, a chilling sight awaited us. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered, and next to it, scratched into the dirt, were the words "You should have stayed hidden." In that moment, a wave of terror washed over us. We packed our things in silence, hearts racing, and bolted for the car, vowing never to return. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods, and for a brief second, I could have sworn I saw the same figures standing among the trees, their lanterns flickering like dying stars. I had been a park ranger for just over a year, and it was a crisp October evening when I found myself on night patrol. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind whispered through the trees. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow that illuminated the path ahead. I loved this time of year. The air was cool, and the vibrant autumn colors made the woods feel alive. As I rounded a bend, my radio crackled to life. I heard the anxious voice of another ranger. He reported that a group of campers hadn't returned from their hike and were overdue. Concern flooded me as I noted the time. It was getting late, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. I assured him I would head out to look for them. With my flashlight in hand, I set off down the trail. The deeper I ventured into the woods, the more the world around me faded into shadows. I called out to the campers as I walked, hoping to hear a response, but the only reply was the haunting echo of my own voice. Suddenly, I heard something in the distance: laughter. It sounded like it was coming from deeper in the forest. I quickened my pace, the sound of laughter growing louder as I moved closer. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The laughter had taken on an unsettling tone, almost mocking. I broke through the underbrush and stumbled into a clearing. My flashlight beam flickered over several tents set up in a semicircle, but the laughter had ceased. The clearing was empty, and the campers were nowhere to be seen. A chill crept up my spine. It felt as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I decided to check the tents. As I unzipped the flap of the first tent, my heart raced. Inside, it was just a mess of sleeping bags and camping gear. No sign of struggle, no indication anyone had been here recently. I moved to the next tent, and when I unzipped it, I was hit by a strange smell, something sweet and putrid. I froze. There was something off about the air. I looked around, feeling a deep sense of unease settle in. I scanned the clearing, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The trees loomed tall and dark, and I could hear the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. That's when I noticed a dark figure standing at the edge of the woods, partially hidden behind a tree. My pulse quickened, and I gripped my flashlight tighter. I called out, demanding to know who was there. The figure didn't move. I took a hesitant step closer, shining my light toward the figure. As I did, it stepped out from behind the tree, revealing itself. It was a person, but something was horribly wrong. Their limbs were contorted, and their eyes were wide and unblinking. A chill shot through me. This was not a camper. Just then, the laughter erupted again, this time much closer, echoing through the trees. It was a chorus of voices, high-pitched and mocking, like children playing a twisted game. I felt my heart race as the figure began to move toward me, its body swaying unnaturally. I stumbled back, my instincts screaming at me to run. As I turned to flee, I tripped over a root and fell hard to the ground. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back toward the trail, the laughter ringing in my ears. I could hear footsteps behind me, quick and light, as if they were chasing me. I burst out of the woods and onto the main path, gasping for breath. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back until I reached the ranger station. When I finally made it, I slammed the door behind me, locking it tight. I collapsed against the wall, trying to steady my racing heart. My radio crackled again, pulling me from my panic. The other ranger's voice cut through, frantic and desperate. He had found the campers huddled together in their tents, but they were terrified and refusing to come out. They had heard the laughter too, but it had stopped as soon as they entered the tents. I felt a chill wash over me. As I relayed what I had seen, I looked out the window into the dark woods. The laughter started again, echoing from the trees, and I realized with horror that the campers had been lured away. Whatever had been in the woods wasn't finished with us yet. The mocking laughter filled the air, and I knew deep down that the forest was hiding more than just shadows. It was alive, and it would not let us go easily. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights alone in the deep woods, but nothing prepared me for that Halloween weekend. The air was thick with an eerie silence as I patrolled the trails, the trees standing like dark sentinels under the moonlight. Most campers had left for the season, leaving only a handful of brave souls to brave the chill. I didn't mind. The quiet was almost comforting. That evening, I received a radio call from a family camping in the more isolated part of the park. They were having a Halloween-themed campfire and invited me to join. I was hesitant, but agreed, thinking it would be good to check on them. I set out, flashlight in hand, making my way through the winding trails. The moon was a mere sliver in the sky, casting unsettling shadows that danced around me. As I approached their campsite, I felt a chill creep up my spine. The fire flickered weakly, illuminating the faces of the family, two parents and their young daughter, all dressed in Halloween costumes. They greeted me warmly, inviting me to sit with them. The smell of roasting marshmallows filled the air, and laughter echoed through the trees. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then, the girl, dressed as a ghost, pointed to the tree line. "Look, there's someone over there," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I turned to see nothing but the dark outline of the trees. The parents laughed it off, but my instincts kicked in. I brushed it aside, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light or perhaps an animal. But as I settled in, unease settled in my stomach. The night wore on, and the girl continued to glance nervously toward the woods. She kept insisting there was someone watching us. The adults dismissed her claims, but I felt a prickle of fear. Just then, a loud rustle erupted from the bushes. My heart raced as I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, its beam trembling. The parents jumped to their feet, trying to reassure their daughter. But as I stood, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall silhouette. My breath caught in my throat as I shone the light in its direction. The figure was thin and gaunt, its face obscured by a mask, but I could see the glint of something metallic in its hand. The parents screamed, and the girl hid behind her father. "Stay back," I shouted, stepping forward. The figure didn't move, its presence unnaturally still. Just as fear began to take hold, the family bolted in the opposite direction, leaving me alone. My instincts kicked in, and I followed, shouting for them to stop. We ran through the dark forest, panic rising with every step. I could hear the figure following us, its footfalls light yet relentless. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was toying with us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The path twisted and turned, and I began to lose my bearings. The woods felt alive, branches reaching out like claws as we hurried through the underbrush. Suddenly, we burst into a small clearing, the moonlight illuminating our frantic faces. The parents were panting, the little girl crying. Just then, the figure emerged behind us, and I instinctively stepped in front of the family. I was ready to confront whatever horror this was when, without warning, the figure reached up and pulled off its mask. To my disbelief, it was a fellow park ranger I worked with, wearing a goofy smile and holding a fake axe. "Surprise," he shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. The family and I stood there, stunned. Relief washed over me, quickly replaced by frustration. What the hell was that? I yelled. The ranger explained that he wanted to give the campers a Halloween scare, but clearly, he had taken it too far. The family was just as confused, their fear slowly turning to anger. The little girl, wiping her tears, asked, "Is that a real axe?" "No, sweetheart, it's just a prop," he said, chuckling. Just then, I noticed something behind him, a rustle in the bushes. My heart dropped as I turned my flashlight toward the sound. Out of the shadows stepped a real figure, hunched and menacing, with a glint of silver reflecting in the light. The ranger's face drained of color, and I realized with horror that the prank had attracted something far more sinister. The family and I backed away, panic setting in again as the true danger revealed itself. This was no joke anymore. The ranger dropped his prop and we all turned to run, leaving the clearing behind, our previous fright replaced by sheer terror. The woods, once familiar and safe, now felt like a haunted labyrinth, every shadow a potential threat. In the end, we all survived, but I knew I would never see the woods the same way again. The night had started with a scare, but had turned into something real and terrifying. It reminded me that sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are not just figments of our imagination, and the woods hold secrets that should remain undisturbed. The autumn sun had already dipped behind the treetops when I arrived at the remote campsite. I was the only park ranger on duty, and the silence of the forest felt heavy. I had always loved the peace of the woods, but that night, an unsettling feeling crept in like the chill of the evening air. I had just finished my evening rounds when a family of 4 set up camp nearby. They were cheerful and excited, their laughter echoing through the trees. I introduced myself and reminded them to keep food stored properly to avoid any wildlife encounters. They laughed it off, the father joking that they were just going to eat s'mores anyway. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Later, as darkness enveloped the forest, I started my night shift, equipped with my flashlight and radio. The trees loomed larger, their shadows stretching like fingers across the ground. A gust of wind rustled the leaves, making the night feel alive, as if it were watching. The radio crackled to life, interrupting the eerie quiet. It was the father from the nearby campsite. His voice trembled as he reported strange noises outside their tent. I assured him that it was probably just a deer or a raccoon and that they should stay inside. After I hung up, I couldn't help but glance toward their campsite. The tent was dark, but I could see faint shadows moving inside. A few minutes later, I decided to check on them, wanting to ease their minds. As I walked closer, I heard a loud crash. It sounded like something heavy had fallen nearby. My heart raced. I approached the tent cautiously, shining my flashlight toward the sound. When suddenly I heard the father scream, I ran toward the tent, calling out to the family. The air felt electric, charged with fear. I reached the tent, and the father burst out, eyes wide and panicked. He shouted about something in the woods, something big. Before I could calm him down, I heard it. A low growl, unlike anything had ever encountered, reverberated through the trees. My instincts kicked in, and I ordered the family to stay close to me. We moved cautiously toward the source of the noise, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The growl echoed again, closer this time, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was followed by unsettling silence, as if the forest held its breath. Suddenly, something darted between the trees. A glimpse of movement caught my eye. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight in that direction, but it was gone. I turned to the family, urging them to stay quiet and remain alert. Just as I began to feel a sense of control, the ground shook beneath us. A massive figure emerged from the trees, towering and shadowy, its eyes glowing with a menacing light. I froze, my mind racing for an explanation. The father grabbed his children, pulling them back toward me. The creature opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and let out a deafening roar. In a panic, I turned to run, dragging the family with me. We sprinted back toward the campsite, my flashlight flickering as the creature pursued us. I could hear its heavy footsteps pounding behind us, each step a reminder that we had to escape. I led them to a clearing, hoping to find safety in the open space. As we reached the clearing, the creature stopped abruptly, as if it had hit an invisible wall. We halted in confusion, panting heavily. The father, breathing heavily, asked why it had stopped. I didn't know. I aimed my flashlight at the creature, and as the beam landed on it, the glow of its eyes flickered out. Suddenly, a blinding light enveloped the clearing, illuminating everything around us. The creature vanished. I blinked, disoriented. The family looked at me, fear still etched on their faces. I assured them we were safe, but deep down, I was shaken. As we made our way back to the campsite, I noticed something strange. The ground was undisturbed, no signs of the chase we had just experienced. We packed up quickly and returned to the park entrance. I glanced back one last time at the woods, where shadows danced in the fading light. I would never forget that night or the creature we never truly saw, and I would never understand what happened in that clearing. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, lurking just beyond the edge of the forest, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitors. Last summer, my friends and I decided to escape the chaos of city life with a weekend camping trip in the wilderness. It was just me, Sarah, and Tom, excited to reconnect with nature. We picked a secluded spot by a picturesque lake, surrounded by tall pines and dense underbrush. The kind of place where you can hear the soothing sounds of water lapping at the shore. We arrived in the early afternoon, and setting up our tents, we spent the day hiking and swimming. As night fell, we lit a campfire and sat around it, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky transformed into a blanket of stars. It felt perfect until it didn't. As darkness enveloped us, the forest grew silent. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves vanished, replaced by unsettling stillness. The crackling of our campfire was the only sound we could hear. Sarah was the first to notice something strange. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her brow furrowed. I paused, straining to listen. At first, I didn't hear anything out of the ordinary, but then it came a faint whispering carried by the wind. It sounded like distant voices, just beyond the reach of comprehension. Tom shrugged it off, attributing it to the wind playing tricks, but I felt a chill run down my spine. As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, a low hum that seemed to surround us. It was as if the forest itself was alive, trying to communicate. The sounds twisted and turned, echoing through the trees, and soon, it felt like the whispers were getting closer. I glanced at Sarah, who looked just as unnerved as I felt. "Let's go check it out," I suggested, trying to mask my fear with bravado. Sarah and Tom exchanged hesitant glances, but eventually agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured into the darkness. Following the sound, the beam of my flashlight sliced through the thick darkness, illuminating the trees and underbrush. The whispers were clearer now, though still unintelligible. They seemed to dance just beyond our line of sight, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't pinpoint their source. It was as if they were taunting us, leading us deeper into the woods. "Maybe we should turn back," Tom said, glancing nervously at the shadows. I could sense his discomfort, but curiosity propelled us forward. After all, it's just the wind, right? Just some rustling branches. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, plunging us into an eerie silence. We stood still, our breaths visible in the cold night air, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. It was then that we realized we were completely disoriented. The trees looked unfamiliar, and the path we thought we were following had vanished. Panic bubbled up inside me, but I took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. "We need to retrace our steps," I said, though uncertainty crept into my voice. We turned back, following the faintest memory of our previous trail. After what felt like an eternity, we finally stumbled back into the clearing where our campsite was. The campfire still flickered, casting a warm glow that felt welcoming. We collapsed onto the ground, relieved to be back, our hearts racing from the adrenaline and fear. The whispers had ceased, leaving us with a lingering unease. We spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, sharing stories to fill the silence. No one spoke about what we had heard in the woods, but the experience changed us. The next morning, we packed up quickly, eager to leave the forest behind. As we drove away, I glanced back at the trees, still standing tall and silent, holding onto their secrets. I don't know what we experienced that night, but the whispers remain etched in my memory, a haunting reminder of the unknown that lurks just beyond the edge of the light. The sun was setting as we arrived at our camping spot deep in the woods. My friends and I had planned this trip for months, eager to escape the chaos of our daily lives. We set up our tents, built a fire, and settled in for a cozy night under the stars. As the darkness enveloped us, we shared stories and laughter, the flickering flames creating an inviting warmth. After a few hours, The conversation turned toward the strange occurrences that supposedly haunted the woods. My friend Sarah spoke up, her voice a mix of excitement and fear. She had heard rumors of people disappearing in these woods, only to reappear days later, babbling about things they had seen. We laughed it off, our spirits too high to let fear creep in. But the atmosphere shifted when a low, guttural growl pierced the night, freezing us in our seats. We exchanged nervous glances, but curiosity outweighed our fear. We decided to investigate the source of the noise. Flashlights in hand, we trudged deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around us. The further we walked, the more the sounds intensified, a mix of rustling leaves and soft whispers that sent chills down my spine. It felt like we were being watched, and every instinct screamed for us to turn back. As we ventured on, we stumbled upon a clearing illuminated by a pale moon. In the center stood a strange, decrepit tree that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Its gnarled branches twisted skyward like skeletal fingers, and the air around it felt heavy with dread. Suddenly, another growl echoed from behind us, closer this time. Panic surged through us, and we sprinted back toward the campsite. We reached our tents, hearts racing, and tried to shake off the unease. We huddled around the fire, recounting our experience. Laughter returned, but the atmosphere was different now. The woods felt alive, watching us. Just as we began to settle down, the growling returned, this time louder and more aggressive. It was as if something was angry we had intruded on its territory. Fearing for our safety, we decided to barricade ourselves inside our tents for the night. The growling continued, mixing with strange, unintelligible whispers that seemed to surround us. I could hear my friend's shallow breaths, the tension palpable in the air. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just the woods playing tricks on us, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, heart pounding, listening to the world outside. Then, just as I thought I might drift off, a loud crash echoed through the darkness, followed by frantic wrestling. I shot upright, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I could hear my friends whispering, their voices laced with panic. Suddenly, the tent flaps burst open, and Sarah stumbled inside, her face pale and wild. "It's out there," she gasped. "We need to go now." Before we could ask what she meant, she froze, eyes wide with terror. I followed her gaze, and my stomach dropped. Outside, silhouetted against the moonlight, were three figures, each wearing tattered clothing and long hair that hung in front of their faces. They stood motionless, staring directly at us, their bodies swaying as if caught in some unseen breeze. I could hardly breathe as I realized they were not human. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, and disjointed. Before we could react, one of the figures let out a high-pitched screech that sent shockwaves of fear through me. I grabbed my friends, pulling them down to the ground as the figures began to move toward us, each step deliberate and slow. As they approached, a wave of darkness seemed to envelop them, making it hard to see clearly. I felt a pull, as if they were beckoning me to join them. My mind raced with terror, but in that moment, a strange calm washed over me. I could hear them whispering, their voices sweet and soothing, promising safety and comfort. Then, just as abruptly, the figures stopped, their heads jerking back as if sensing something. In an instant, they turned and fled into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as they had come. We remained frozen, too terrified to speak. When dawn broke, we gathered our things, the fear still thick in the air. As we packed up, I noticed something etched into the dirt by our fire pit. The words read, "We will find you when the moon rises again." We rushed back to our car, glancing over our shoulders, every rustle in the trees igniting panic. We drove away in silence, a sense of dread lingering as we left the woods behind. Little did we know, those figures were not gone. They had simply retreated, watching, waiting for the night to claim us once more. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. A few friends, a campsite in the woods, and the kind of quiet that can only come from being far off the beaten path. We thought we were prepared. Tents, a campfire, enough food for 2 days, and a cooler full of cold drinks. But I'll never forget how quickly that peace shattered. It started with the walk to the site. We arrived late in the afternoon, and there was something off about the air. It was thick, almost suffocating, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. It was just the wilderness, right? nature doing its thing. But the closer we got to our spot, the more the trees seemed to close in on us. The path grew narrower and the shadows grew deeper. By the time we set up camp, the sun was barely a sliver in the sky. I'd heard the stories about strange things happening in the woods, voices on the wind, lights flickering in the distance, but I was skeptical. I was determined to have a good time, not let the usual campfire tales spook me. We set up the tents, lit the fire, and joked around. I figured it'd be the perfect escape, but then came the first odd thing. Around dusk, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the trees, not moving, just standing there, watching. At first, I thought it was a person who had wandered off the trail, maybe another camper. But there was something wrong about how still they were. No shifting of weight, no fidgeting, just watching. I pointed it out to my friends, but when they turned to look, it was gone. I laughed it off. My friends did too. It was probably an animal or a trick of the light. But then, as the fire crackled and the darkness deepened, I noticed something else: soft, deliberate footsteps, like someone was walking just outside the camp. Again, I told myself it was nothing. But the footsteps continued. They circled the camp, first to the left, then to the right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. At one point, I heard the unmistakable sound of a breath, shallow and quick, like someone was standing behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My friend Sam whispered, "Did you hear that?" We all heard it. Soft voices, too faint to make out, were carried on the breeze. They didn't sound like words, more like whispers, but the tone was unmistakable, a low murmur, as if a group of people was standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, talking in a language none of us understood. That's when we decided it was time to go. We started packing up our things, but as I turned to grab the cooler, I saw something that made my heart stop: a handprint on the outside of the tent, smeared, like something had been pressing against it. But we had all been standing inside the tent the entire time. No one had touched it. We stared at it for a long time, the fire crackling in the silence between us. The footsteps had stopped, but the whispers were getting louder, more insistent. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something moving in the trees. A figure, crouched low, weaving through the trunks. It was too fast, too fluid to be a person, too wrong. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. My legs were frozen. That's when the first true jump scare hit. A loud bang, like something heavy being thrown against our tent. The entire structure shook, and the fire flickered, casting distorted shadows across the ground. We all stumbled back, our breaths ragged, and that's when we saw an unmistakable trail of blood, starting from the edge of the camp and leading toward the woods. It wasn't animal blood. It was too dark, too thick. We ran. There was no hesitation. We grabbed what we could, threw it in the truck, and sped off, hearts hammering in our chests. When we finally got home, we thought it was over. But a few days later, as I was unpacking my bag, I found something in my jacket pocket: a small, torn scrap of fabric, dark red, stained with something that looked like dirt. But the strangest part, the fabric was exactly like the material of the tents we had set up that weekend. I stared at it for what felt like hours. My thoughts scrambled. Had something been with us in the woods? Something that we didn't see? Had it been in our tent the entire time? I didn't want to think about it, but the more I tried to push the thought away, the clearer it became. The whispers, the figure in the trees, the handprint, the blood trail, and that piece of fabric, something that definitely wasn't ours. We never went back to those woods. But I still wonder, what was it that we didn't see? What was circling our camp, watching us, following us? Whatever it was, it didn't let us go. Camping had always been my escape from the chaos of everyday life. When my friends suggested a weekend trip to a remote site deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. We packed our gear, loaded up the car, and drove until the city lights vanished behind us. The excitement buzzed in the air as we set up camp, and I felt an undeniable thrill at the prospect of sleeping under the stars. As night fell, the forest transformed, shadows deepened, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures filled the air. We gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter, the flames casting flickering shadows on our faces. But as the night wore on, a strange unease settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midnight, My friend Jenna suggested we explore the woods a bit further. Feeling adventurous and slightly emboldened by the warmth of the fire, we agreed. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the darkness, the beam of light slicing through the thick air. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and every rustle made my heart race. As we walked deeper into the woods, a cold wind swept through the trees, chilling me to the bone. Then, from somewhere nearby, we heard it, a low, guttural sound. My stomach twisted into knots, and I exchanged nervous glances with my friends. Jenna, ever the jokester, laughed it off and urged us to keep going. Despite my instinct screaming to turn back, I followed, curiosity overriding my fear. Then we saw it. A flickering light in the distance, just beyond a thicket of trees. It glowed like a beacon, and we instinctively moved toward it. As we approached, I felt a rising sense of dread. The light danced erratically, illuminating something that looked like figures standing in a clearing. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Suddenly, the sound of chains clanking filled the air, growing louder and closer. Panic surged through me, and we all froze. What were those figures? Were they real? Jenna whispered that we should hide, and we quickly ducked behind a large tree, our hearts pounding. Peering around the trunk, we saw the figures more clearly. They were cloaked in ragged white fabric, their faces obscured by masks that were painted to resemble anguished expressions. Each figure held a lantern, and the light glinted off the chains wrapped around their bodies. They moved slowly, almost like they were searching for something. The clinking of their chains echoed ominously through the stillness of the night. My pulse raced as fear gripped me. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Just then, one of the figures turned, and for a moment, our eyes locked. The mask hid its face, but I felt a chill run down my spine, as if it were staring directly into my soul. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I remained frozen, paralyzed by terror. The figures began to move again, continuing their slow march through the woods. As they faded into the distance, I finally found my voice. "We should get back to camp," I urged, my heart pounding in my ears. The others nodded, their faces pale, and we turned to make our way back. We stumbled through the darkness, adrenaline fueling our every step. As we broke through the trees and reached our campsite, relief washed over me. But that relief was short-lived. Our camp was in disarray. The tents were torn, and the fire had been doused. Panic gripped us again. What happened here? Jenna screamed when she spotted something on the ground. We rushed over, and my stomach dropped. There, scratched into the earth, were the words, "We will find you." The message was clear and chilling. We gathered what we could and raced to the car, each of us glancing over our shoulders as if expecting to see those figures emerge from the shadows. As we sped away, the forest receding behind us, I thought about the figures. They had looked so surreal, so dreamlike, yet the fear they inspired felt painfully real. I glanced back one last time, and for a split second, I thought I saw one of the masked figures standing at the edge of the trees, lantern glowing softly in the darkness, watching us leave. That image haunts me still, a terrifying reminder that some things in the woods are better left undisturbed. I never spoke of that night to anyone, afraid they might think I was losing my grip on reality. Sometimes, when I find myself alone at night, the memory of those chains clanking sends a chill through my bones, and I wonder if they ever really let us go. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend in the woods with friends. We had planned this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the chaos of daily life. I drove us deep into the forest, the road narrowing until it became a mere trail. The trees towered over us, their leaves whispering secrets in the wind. As we set up camp, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving an eerie twilight that seemed to cloak the world in mystery. After a hearty dinner, we gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. The flames danced, illuminating our faces and casting long shadows on the trees. My friends, Yena, Matt, and Aaron, were all in high spirits, but I felt a strange unease creeping in. The woods were too quiet, too still, as if they were holding their breath. Yena suggested we go for a night hike. She had a way of always being the bravest among us, and her enthusiasm was infectious. Reluctantly, we agreed, grabbing our flashlights and venturing into the darkness. The beam of light illuminated the narrow path ahead, but the darkness quickly swallowed everything beyond. As we walked, the sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence that gnawed at the edges of my mind. About a half-mile in, we heard it. A low, rhythmic sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. It stopped us in our tracks. My heart raced, and I exchanged nervous glances with my friends. Matt suggested we investigate, and against my better judgment, we moved toward the sound. As we crept through the underbrush, we stumbled upon a clearing. What we saw made my blood run cold. There, in the center, were chains linked to a massive tree stump. The chains were rusted and old, and next to them lay a small lantern flickering weakly. Panic surged through me, but before I could suggest we turn back, we heard a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. We strained to listen, and then we saw them. Figures appeared at the edge of the clearing, cloaked in shadow, moving closer. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods, and they were holding lanterns. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they were dragging chains behind them. The same sound we had heard moments before. We froze, hearts pounding, as they approached the lantern. There were at least 5 of them, silent and ominous, and I could feel a primal urge to run. Yena, however, whispered for us to stay hidden. My instincts screamed for me to flee, but the combination of fear and curiosity rooted me in place. Suddenly, one of the figures turned sharply, shining a lantern in our direction. Light flooded the area, and for a split second, I could see its face, a pale mask, expressionless and hollow. The sight sent me into a panic, and I grabbed Gina's arm, urging her to run. We bolted through the trees, the sound of chains clanking behind us as the figures began to follow. We sprinted back to camp, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. My mind raced with the image of those masked figures, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted. As we reached our campsite, we stopped, looking for signs of life. The fire had gone cold, and the area was eerily quiet, but something was off. Our tents were still standing, yet everything felt wrong. In the center of our campsite, engraved in the ground, was a message: "You shouldn't have come here." The letters were crude, as if scratched by something sharp and heavy. Panic surged again, and we scrambled to gather our belongings, adrenaline fueling our movements. Just as we finished packing, we heard the chains again, much closer this time. I glanced toward the tree line and saw the flicker of lanterns. We dashed to the car, fumbling with the keys. Our hearts racing, we jumped inside, slamming the doors as I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I backed out of the campsite. As we sped down the trail, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figures stood at the edge of the woods, their lanterns casting an eerie glow in the darkness. But as I looked closer, my stomach dropped. There was no one there. The figures had vanished, yet the lanterns still flickered ominously. The realization hit me like a cold wave. We weren't running from something in the woods. We had been lured here, and now something had marked us, watching from the darkness. The sense of dread settled in as we drove away, knowing we would never return to those woods again. As a park ranger, I had grown accustomed to the eerie stillness of the woods. It was mid-October, and the vibrant autumn leaves painted the landscape in fiery reds and oranges. Most visitors had left, leaving the park in a haunting solitude that felt almost alive. I was patrolling the area when I received a call over the radio. A family had reported hearing strange noises outside their tent, something that sounded large and menacing. I set out on foot, a flashlight in hand, my heart racing. The night air was thick with tension, and the shadows loomed ominously among the trees. The path to the campsite felt longer than usual, each snap of a twig underfoot echoing in the stillness. The family had set up camp deep in the woods, far away from the main trails. As I approached, I noticed an unusual quiet, the kind of silence that seems to hold its breath. When I reached their campsite, the tension in the air became palpable. The tent was unzipped but empty, their belongings strewn about haphazardly. My gut twisted as I called out for them. No response. I stepped inside the tent, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Everything appeared untouched, but the unsettling absence of the family gnawed at me. I heard it then, a low growl that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back outside, scanning the perimeter. My heart raced as I noticed fresh claw marks on the ground, deep and jagged, surrounding the tent. I cursed under my breath, my instinct screaming that something was very wrong. I should have turned back then, but my ranger training kicked in. I had to find them. I ventured deeper into the woods, calling out for the family. The growl reverberated through the trees again, closer this time. It was guttural, a sound that belonged to something primal. Suddenly, a figure darted through the trees, its movement too swift for a human. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of a tall, lanky silhouette with glowing eyes. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, the darkness swallowing my light. I turned and ran, branches scratching at my arms as I darted through the underbrush. I heard it behind me, its growl morphing into a harsh cackle that pierced the night. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline pumping through my veins, desperate to escape whatever hunted me. Finally, I burst onto a familiar trail, breathless and disoriented. I fumbled for my radio, calling for backup, my voice a frantic whisper in the static. I didn't want to admit how scared I was, but fear clawed at my insides. As I waited, I could hear the rustling in the bushes, that low growl echoing closer. I turned, prepared to face whatever came next. Moments later, another ranger arrived, flashlight beaming into the dark. Relief washed over me, but I quickly warned him of the creature. We gathered our courage and approached the family's campsite, but the creature was gone. The only signs of disturbance were the deep claw marks and the ransacked tent. Then we heard its screams coming from deeper in the woods. My stomach twisted as we sprinted toward the sound, hearts pounding. What if we were too late? As we reached a clearing, we saw the family huddled together, terrified but unharmed. The relief was overwhelming until I turned to see what they were pointing at. In the center of the clearing stood the creature, its long limbs twitching and contorting in unnatural ways. But then I realized something horrifying. The creature was mimicking the father's voice. "Help me," it called, but the tone was twisted, dripping with malice. It wasn't just a monster. It was a horrifying imitation, feeding on their fear. In that moment, everything clicked. The growls were not of a beast, but of a being capable of deception. It fed on the fear of its prey, luring them into the darkness. We backed away slowly, not daring to turn our backs on it, the family still frozen in shock. My heart raced as I realized our only chance was to leave this clearing. We moved together, inching backward until we were out of its reach. The creature screeched in frustration, the sound echoing through the trees. I grabbed the family's arms, urging them to run. The woods felt alive with danger as we raced back to safety, knowing we had escaped a fate worse than we could imagine. As we reached the edge of the park, I glanced back at the dark woods, knowing the true horror had only just begun. I've spent years working as a park ranger in the deep woods. My shifts usually consisted of monitoring trails, checking campsites, and ensuring visitors adhered to safety guidelines. Autumn had set in, painting the forest in a tapestry of orange and crimson. The air felt electric, tinged with an anticipation I couldn't quite shake. On this particular evening, I was tasked with patrolling a remote campsite that had recently reported some strange disturbances. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I grabbed my flashlight and set off along the narrow trail leading to the site. The shadows grew longer, twisting into menacing shapes among the trees. The silence felt thick, almost suffocating. I brushed off the unsettling feeling and focused on my job. After all, I had encountered my fair share of oddities in the woods. When I arrived at the campsite, I noticed it was unusually quiet. The fire pit lay cold, and the tents stood like sentinels, their flaps flapping gently in the breeze. I called out to see if anyone was around, but received no answer. A tingle of unease prickled my spine. I began checking the tents one by one. The first tent was empty, save for some gear strewn about. The second tent, however, caught my attention. I unzipped the flap and peered inside. It was dark, the light from my flashlight barely illuminating the space. I stepped in and felt a chill sweep over me. The sleeping bags were rolled up, but something was off. There was a half-eaten granola bar lying on the ground, and a backpack was haphazardly tossed in the corner, as if someone had left in a hurry. My instincts kicked in, and I quickly exited the tent. I decided to check the surrounding area. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt the air grow heavier. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, but it carried with it an unsettling whisper. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I was just being paranoid. That's when I heard a faint sound, almost like a child laughing. I turned, heart pounding in my chest, and started walking towards the direction of the sound. The laughter echoed in a way that sent chills down my spine. It was innocent, yet the deeper I went into the woods, the more distorted it became. It was laced with a hint of something dark, something wrong. As I ventured deeper, I spotted a flicker of light through the trees. I followed it, thinking it might lead me to whoever had been camping, but as I drew closer, the laughter ceased, replaced by a profound silence. I stepped into a clearing and felt my breath catch in my throat. There, in the center, stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree lay a circle of stones, each one covered in strange markings. I crouched to examine them, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. Just then, I heard rustling behind me. I whipped around, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. Nothing was there. I was alone, or so I thought. Suddenly, a sharp whisper cut through the air, sending icy fingers creeping up my spine. It was a voice, chillingly familiar, echoing my name. I stumbled backward, heart racing, realizing it sounded just like my sister. Confused and terrified, I called out, asking if anyone was there. The whispers intensified, now blending into a cacophony of voices, all calling my name. My heart pounded louder, drowning out the chaos. I felt disoriented, panic threatening to take hold. Then I spotted something moving in the shadows, a figure darting between the trees. I trained my flashlight on it, revealing a face that made my blood run cold. It was a child, eyes wide and terrified, a look of pure horror etched on her face. I rushed toward her, ready to ask if she was lost. But as I reached her, she opened her mouth, and an unearthly scream erupted from her. The sound shattered the night, reverberating in my chest. I stumbled backward, realizing the child's face was not just frightened, but twisted, warped into something inhuman. I turned to run, but felt a tug on my shirt, yanking me back. I looked down to see skeletal hands emerging from the ground, grasping at me. I screamed and broke free, sprinting back toward the trail, adrenaline coursing through my veins. When I finally reached the safety of my vehicle, I locked the doors, heart racing, hands trembling. I looked back at the woods, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The eerie laughter had returned, ringing in my ears, echoing my deepest fears. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my truck, shaken, the forest looming dark and silent around me. As dawn broke, I vowed never to return to that spot, never to speak of it again. I thought about the child I saw, and the sinister whispers that echoed through the trees. I knew one thing for certain: the woods were alive with secrets, and some truths were best left buried. I had been a park ranger for several years, but nothing prepared me for that night. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath my boots as I patrolled the remote campground. It was late October, and most campers had left. I enjoyed the solitude of the deep woods, the silence that only nature could provide. But on that night, an unsettling feeling crept over me, like fingers of cold dread wrapping around my spine. As I checked the campsites, my radio crackled to life. The voice of another ranger broke through the static. He reported a family that had set up camp late in the day. They planned to stay overnight but had not checked in. This wasn't unusual, but my instincts told me something was off. I decided to investigate, walking deeper into the woods. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the tall trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As I approached the family's campsite, I noticed an odd stillness in the air. The chirping of crickets had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. When I reached the clearing, I found the tent still standing, but there was no sign of the family. I called out to them, but my voice echoed back with no response. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent flap, peering inside. Their belongings were scattered about: sleeping bags, cooking gear, but no people. Panic gnawed at my stomach. Suddenly, I heard rustling nearby. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating a small animal scurrying into the underbrush. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but then I heard a low growl coming from the tree line. The sound was unlike anything I had ever encountered, a guttural noise that sent shivers down my spine. I stepped back, trying to rationalize it. It could be a bear, I thought, but deep down, I knew this was different. The growl was closer now, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had to get back to the ranger station and call for help, but as I turned to leave, a sharp rustle came from behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the bushes. I bolted toward the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My flashlight beam flickered erratically as I sprinted, the shadows seeming to twist and stretch around me. I dared a glance back, but nothing was there. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, but I pressed on, pushing through the underbrush dot. As I reached the main trail, I heard laughter, a child's laughter echoing from the campsite. Confused, I stopped in my tracks. The family must have returned, I thought. I called out, relief flooding through me. I turned back toward the clearing, but there was only darkness. The laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Just then, a voice broke the stillness, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all directions. "Help us!" I froze, the blood draining from my face. It sounded like the family. I raced back to the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, the tent was still empty. I called out again, desperation creeping into my voice. "Where are you?" My flashlight beam flickered wildly as I scanned the area. That's when I saw them figures standing just beyond the tree line. They looked like the family, but they were all turned away from me, their backs facing the campsite. "Are you okay?" I shouted, my voice trembling. They didn't respond, just stood there motionless. I stepped closer, dread pulling in my stomach. And that's when I realized they weren't moving at all. Their clothes were tattered, and their hair hung in wild tangles. The moonlight illuminated their forms, and my breath caught in my throat. With a sudden rush of fear, I turned and ran back toward my truck. I could feel something hot on my heels, a presence that I dared not look back at. I jumped into the vehicle, slamming the door and locking it tight. My hands shook as I started the engine, and as I sped away, I caught a glimpse of the figures in my rearview mirror, standing silently, watching. Later, I reported the missing family. Search teams combed the area for days, but found no trace of them. The park closed for the season, and the other rangers reassured me that it was likely to be just a case of people getting lost, but I knew what I saw. I often wonder if they are still out there, trapped in the woods, forever whispering for help, their laughter fading into the night, their figures watching from the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far into the dark. I always thought being a park ranger would be a peaceful job. I spent my days hiking the trails, keeping an eye on the wildlife, and sharing my love for the outdoors with visitors. But that all changed one fateful autumn night. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I wrapped up my last patrol and headed back to the ranger station. The woods took on a different feel after dark, and even though I was alone, I felt a strange sense of unease. I locked up the station and decided to take a short walk before heading home. There was something about the silence that drew me in. I wandered deeper into the woods, the flashlight beam dancing between the trees. The familiar paths felt different in the dark, and every crack of a twig made my heart race. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise, a low, grating sound. It seemed to come from somewhere nearby. I stopped, holding my breath, and listened. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered in the forest. It sounded almost like someone whispering, but there was a raspy edge to it. I shivered, dismissing it as my imagination running wild. Continuing my walk, I stumbled upon an old camping site. The fire pit was cold, the logs arranged haphazardly. I remembered this spot. It was a popular camping area for families. I pulled out my radio, ready to check in with the other rangers, when I noticed something strange. There were two sets of footprints leading away from the site, but they were mixed with something else, something that looked like claw marks. My heart began to pound as I knelt to inspect them. The prints were large, almost too big to belong to any animal in the area. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light, but the feeling of being watched crept back in. I stood up, suddenly feeling exposed. That's when I heard it again, the grating whispering. It was closer this time. I swung my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. I stepped back, feeling a chill run down my spine. The whispers intensified, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run. I turned and sprinted back toward the path, the light bouncing erratically in front of me. Just as I rounded a corner, My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled forward, crashing to the ground. The flashlight flew from my hand, extinguishing the only source of light. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to turn it back on. In the darkness, the whispers became louder, almost mocking. I finally managed to get it working again and aimed the beam into the trees. I was greeted by a horrifying sight. Standing just outside the circle of light was a figure. Tall and thin, with long, gangly limbs, it stood perfectly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I bolted to my feet and ran. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, echoing all around me. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I raced down the path. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and leaned against it, panting heavily. After a few moments, I forced myself to calm down. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. I was just tired from my long day. I flipped the light on and checked my radio. Just as I was about to call it a night, a chilling sound broke through the silence. A soft knock echoed from the door. My heart raced as I approached, hesitantly peering through the window. Outside stood a family: mom, dad, and 2 kids, looking lost and frightened. They explained they had been camping nearby when they heard strange sounds and saw a figure in the woods. They had fled, thinking they would find help. My body relaxed, relieved that I wasn't alone in this. I welcomed them in and made them comfortable while I called for assistance. They described the whispers and the figure, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. As I turned to grab some extra blankets, I glanced back at the window, and that's when I saw it again. The tall, thin figure was standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. But this time, it wasn't alone. The trees were alive with movement, and all around the figure were dozens of those same twisted silhouettes, all staring in silence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I wasn't crazy. The whispers hadn't been in my head. The forest had been hiding something much darker all along. The family beside me had unwittingly stumbled into something I had barely escaped, and now it felt like it was closing in. We had been planning this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and immerse ourselves in nature. My friends and I arrived at the campsite just before sunset, setting up our tents in a secluded area surrounded by towering trees. The air was crisp and fresh, filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. We spent the early evening cooking over the fire, laughing and sharing stories, while the stars began to prick the darkening sky. As darkness settled in, the atmosphere shifted. My friend Lucas, always the jokester, suggested we play a game of truth or dare to spice things up. Amid laughter and playful taunts, Yena, my adventurous friend, dared us to take a night hike into the woods. With a mix of excitement and trepidation, we agreed, grabbing our flashlights and heading into the shadows. The deeper we ventured, the more the forest came alive. The trees loomed around us, their branches creaking in the wind like ghostly whispers. As we walked, I felt an unsettling sensation, like we were being watched. I brushed it off as nerves, convincing myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind. We wandered for what felt like an eternity, our laughter fading as we noticed the forest growing eerily quiet. Just then, a sharp sound pierced the silence, a loud crack, like something heavy breaking through the branches. We all froze, shining our flashlights toward the noise. In the distance, we saw a flicker of light, like a lantern bobbing between the trees. "What is that?" I whispered, my heart racing. Lucas squinted into the darkness, a grin creeping across his face. "Probably just some campers. Let's check it out." Despite my instincts telling me to turn back, curiosity got the better of us. We crept through the underbrush, the flickering light growing brighter as we approached. The air became thick with tension, each step feeling like a mistake. Then, out of nowhere, the lights vanished. "Where did it go?" Yena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before we could answer, the sounds of chains rattling filled the air, sending chills down my spine. Panic washed over us, and we instinctively dove behind a thick bush. Heart pounding, we peered out to see what was happening. My mind raced as I fought to control my breathing. Then we saw them. Figures cloaked in dark, tattered clothing emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by grotesque masks that glimmered in the darkness. Each figure was shackled, chains dragging behind them as they moved with a disturbing, slow grace. Lanterns hung from their hands, illuminating their path and casting haunting shadows on the trees. My stomach dropped as I realized we were not supposed to be here. My instinct screamed for us to run, but we were frozen in place, horror rendering us immobile. The figures shuffled closer, their chains clanking ominously, and for a moment, it felt like the world around us had shrunk to just us and them. I felt Gina's grip tighten on my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I opened my mouth to whisper something reassuring, but no words came. Instead, we watched, breathless, as the procession passed mere feet from our hiding place. I thought I saw one of them glance in our direction, but the lantern's light obscured their eyes. Once the figures moved on, we wasted no time scrambling back the way we came. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as we raced through the underbrush, branches clawing at our clothes. We burst out of the trees, breathless and terrified, collapsing beside our campfire. But when we reached our campsite, we were met with a shocking sight. Our tents lay toppled, gear scattered across the ground. The fire was extinguished, its embers barely glowing. As we scrambled to gather our things, I noticed something carved into the dirt near the fire pit. "You should not have come." A wave of fear washed over us, and we grabbed our belongings in a frenzy, not bothering to gather everything. As we made our way to the car, I glanced back at the campsite one last time. There was no sign of the figures, but the air felt thick with their presence. We drove away, hearts pounding, vowing never to return. But, as we sped down the winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a flickering light. It faded quickly, but the sense of dread remained. What if those figures had followed us? What if they were still watching? The dark woods behind us seemed to breathe, hiding secrets I hoped never to uncover. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friends and I decided to go camping deep in the woods, far away from civilization. We were a group of four: Yana, Matt, Aaron, and me. The trees were ablaze with fall colors, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. We set up our camp near a small clearing, just off a winding path that we had traveled earlier that day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories, each one more ridiculous than the last. As the fire flickered, Yana suggested we go for a night hike. The idea sent a thrill through the group, fueled by both the adrenaline of our earlier laughter and the eerie beauty of the forest at night. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured down the dark trail, the shadows of the trees stretching ominously around us. The further we walked, the thicker the darkness became, and I could feel a strange tension in the air, like something was watching us. As we walked deeper into the woods, an unsettling noise broke the silence. It started as a faint rustling, but quickly escalated into a series of loud, clanking sounds. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The noise was accompanied by an odd flickering light that appeared in the distance. It danced like a candle, illuminating the nearby trees. "Do you see that?" Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. We all stopped, squinting into the darkness. The light grew closer, revealing a series of figures in white masks, each carrying a flickering lantern. They seemed to glide along the path, moving with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. I could see chains wrapped around their bodies, clinking together as they moved. Panic surged through us. I instinctively grabbed Gina's arm, pulling her back into the shadows of the trees. We crouched behind a thick bush, our breaths coming in quick gasps. The figures drew closer, and as they passed by, I caught a glimpse of their empty, hollow eyes staring straight ahead. My heart thundered in my chest, a primal instinct telling me to run, but fear held us frozen in place. As they moved out of sight, the air felt heavy with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were searching for something or someone. We sat in silence, barely daring to breathe, until the last of the figures disappeared into the darkness. After what felt like hours, we finally dared to emerge from our hiding place. Hearts pounding with terror, we decided it was best to return to our camp and pack up. But as we turned back, we were greeted by an even more horrifying sight. Our campsite was in disarray. Tents were ripped open, gear scattered across the ground, and the fire we had built was extinguished, save for a few dying embers. What happened? Aaron stammered, his face pale. But the worst part was what we found etched into the dirt where our fire had been. In crude letters, it read, "We know you're here." My stomach dropped, and I felt a surge of nausea. This wasn't just a prank, it was something far more sinister. Without waiting to grab our belongings, we sprinted back to the car, adrenaline driving us forward. I could hear the distant sounds of chains rattling again, echoing through the trees. Every second felt like an eternity as we stumbled toward our vehicle, fear urging us to move faster. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I finally managed to unlock the doors. We piled in, and I slammed the door shut, heart racing. Just as I turned the key in the ignition, a deafening bang echoed outside, as if something had slammed against the car. We screamed, instinctively ducking down as I gunned the engine and tore down the dirt path, leaving the horrors of the woods behind. As we drove further away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. To my horror, I saw the figures standing at the edge of the forest, their lanterns flickering in the darkness, watching us leave. We never spoke of that night again, but even now, I can still hear the distant clank of chains and feel the weight of those hollow eyes fixed upon me. What still haunts me, the realization that they were waiting, not just for us, but for someone else. Someone who had been there before us, and perhaps would be there again. I prided myself on being familiar with every inch of the woods. It was early October when I was assigned to a remote camping area, known for its beautiful fall foliage. The leaves were bursting with color, and the air was crisp. I looked forward to a quiet night under the stars. I set up my tent near the edge of a clearing, a safe distance from the campsite where a family had pitched their tent. They were friendly, two parents with two kids, eager to explore the woods. As night fell, the crackling fire provided a warm glow. I exchanged stories with them while they roasted marshmallows. When the kids were finally asleep, I said goodnight and retreated to my tent, hoping for a peaceful evening. The tranquility of the woods quickly turned unsettling. I heard strange noises drifting through the trees. A low rustling at first, then the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just the wind or perhaps a deer, but the air felt charged with tension. I peered out of my tent, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. A sudden snap of a branch jolted me upright. My heart raced. I was certain something was watching me. I crawled out of my tent, trying to quiet my breathing, listening intently. That's when I heard it. A faint whimpering, almost childlike, coming from the direction of the family's tent. I called out to them, but there was no response. The whimpering grew louder, echoing through the trees. Compelled by a mix of concern and fear, I cautiously approached their tent. It was unzipped slightly, and I pushed it open, ready to check on the family. The inside was empty, the sleeping bag still warm. Confused, I turned back toward my tent, but as I did, the whimpering stopped. Silence enveloped the woods, thick and suffocating. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity held me in place. Suddenly, I heard a laugh, a high-pitched, gleeful sound that sent chills down my spine. It echoed through the trees, followed by more laughter. It was coming from the deeper woods. I knew the area well. There were no trails leading that way. Ignoring my better judgment, I followed the sound, pushing through the underbrush. With each step, the laughter turned to taunts, mocking me. "Come play with us," they seemed to say. I stumbled, catching my foot on a root, and I fell hard onto the ground. As I got up, I heard footsteps behind me, soft but deliberate. My heart raced as I turned to face whatever was pursuing me. What I saw made my blood run cold. Standing there were two children, their clothes tattered and dirty, faces pale and expressionless. They stared at me with hollow eyes, not a hint of a smile. My breath caught in my throat. They didn't belong here. I felt a surge of panic, my instincts screaming at me to run. Just as I turned to flee, a figure darted past the trees, tall and dark, its form indistinguishable. I sprinted back toward the campsite, my heart pounding in my ears. Reaching my tent, I flung myself inside and zipped it up, my hands trembling. I fumbled for my radio, calling for backup. There was no response. I could only hear my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Just when I thought I was safe, I heard the soft laughter again, right outside my tent. "Come play with us," the voice sang, sweet yet sinister. I held my breath, clutching my flashlight. every fiber of my being urging me to stay quiet. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of something scraping against the tent. I braced myself for the worst. Suddenly, the tent shook violently. I gasped, and the laughter returned, louder and more manic. "We're here," it echoed. I squeezed my eyes shut, counting the seconds until morning, praying for dawn to break. When the sun finally rose, the light spilled into my tent, illuminating the scene outside. I unzipped the entrance slowly, half expecting the dark figure or the children to be waiting. Instead, I found the campsite abandoned. The family's tent lay empty, but what caught my eye was the ground, marked with deep, claw-like scratches leading into the woods. As I stepped outside, I noticed something on the ground. A child's teddy bear lay there, its button eye missing. My heart sank. I turned to look back at the woods, now peaceful and serene, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. I quickly packed my things, determined to report what I had encountered. As I made my way back to my truck, I glanced back one last time at the woods, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw the shadows of two children peering out from the trees, their laughter echoing in the wind. As a park ranger, I've learned to appreciate the serenity of the woods, but that serenity can quickly turn into dread. It was the first week of October when I received a call about a family camping deep in the woods. They'd set up their tent near a secluded lake, and the father reported strange sounds echoing through the trees, unnatural and unsettling. I assured him I would investigate and pack my gear, feeling a growing unease. It was late afternoon when I set out, the sun dipping lower and casting elongated shadows. The path twisted through dense foliage, each step echoing in the silence. The vibrant hues of autumn leaves were almost too beautiful to warrant concern. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I approached the campsite, the air thickened with tension. I spotted their tent nestled among the trees, but noticed something strange. The campsite was eerily quiet. I called out, but only the wind responded. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I pressed on, pushing aside the gnawing feeling in my stomach. The first thing I noticed was a half-empty cooler, and my heart sank. It was as if they had just left, but something felt wrong. I stepped inside the tent, half expecting to see the family gathered around, but it was empty. Their sleeping bags were laid out, but personal items were strewn around as if they had been in a hurry. A flicker of movement caught my eye from outside. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. That's when I heard a low, rhythmic thumping noise coming from the edge of the forest. I followed the sound, my pulse racing. The trees thickened, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. As I approached, the thumping grew louder and seemed to pulse in sync with my heartbeat. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath as I tightened my grip. The beam of light revealed a tall figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was covered in dark, matted hair, and its limbs appeared unnaturally long. I was paralyzed for a moment, and then it turned its head toward me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Before I could react, it vanished behind the trees, leaving only the echo of its thumping sound. Fear coursed through me, and I bolted back toward the campsite. I had to find the family and get them out of here. As I ran, the woods seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my clothes, as if trying to hold me back. When I reached the campsite, I quickly grabbed my radio to call for backup, but it crackled with static. The fear clawing at my throat deepened. Just then, I heard a scream, piercing and desperate, coming from the direction of the lake. I sprinted toward the sound, praying I wasn't too late. I emerged onto the lake shore, and there they were, the family huddled together, staring wide-eyed at something in the water. I followed their gaze, and my stomach dropped. The figure I had seen earlier was now standing knee-deep in the lake, water dripping from its elongated limbs, its face obscured by shadows. In an instant, it turned its head toward us, and I felt a jolt of terror as it took a step forward, moving as fluidly as a shadow. Just then, the family scrambled back, and I shouted at them to run. I grabbed the father's arm, urging him to get his family moving. We ran back through the trees, the fear propelling us forward. I led them to a clearing where we could see the distant glow of the park's visitor center. It felt safe, and the sound of the creature faded behind us. We reached the building, breathless and terrified, but when I turned to check on them, my heart sank. The family was gone. No footprints in the mud, No sign of their presence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had been talking to a family just moments before. I called out for them, panic flooding my senses. Then, I turned around, and there it was again, the creature. This time, it was standing right behind me, a chilling grin stretching across its face. I was frozen in place, but before I could scream, it whispered in a voice that chilled me to the bone. "You shouldn't have come here." And then it vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone, surrounded by the dense woods, knowing that whatever had taken the family would not stop until it claimed me too. As a park ranger, I often patrolled the deeper parts of the woods where few ventured. I loved the solitude, the way the trees enveloped me like a protective embrace. But on one chilly October evening, that solitude took on a sinister edge. I was finishing my last round before heading back to the ranger station. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the setting sun painted the sky in deep oranges and purples. I had my radio tuned to the channel that connected me with other rangers, and as I walked, I felt a sense of unease creeping in. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life. A frantic voice came through. A family camping nearby reported hearing strange noises. The father described it as a low growl, followed by something heavy moving through the brush. My heart raced. I assured him I'd head their way and investigate. The family was about 1.5 miles from where I was. I picked up my pace, my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. As I neared their campsite, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees, tall and ancient, creaked as the wind picked up. I could almost feel them watching me, the shadows lurking just beyond the reach of my light. When I finally arrived, the tent stood eerily still. I called out to the family, but there was no answer. Anxiety twisted my stomach as I unzipped the tent flap. Inside, the sleeping bags were neatly folded, and personal items were still scattered about. But no one was there. Just then, I heard a deep, guttural growl, echoing through the trees. It sent a chill down my spine. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the sound, and my beam fell on a large figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its silhouette was too thin. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out any details, but the eyes, my God, the eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light. I felt my instincts scream at me to run. I took a step back, and that seemed to provoke it. The figure stepped forward, the ground crunching beneath its weight. I bolted. I sprinted through the woods, branches clawing at my arms as I navigated the darkened path. Behind me, I could hear it following, moving with a speed that defied nature. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I burst out onto the main trail, gasping for breath as I raced toward the ranger station. When I arrived, I quickly grabbed my radio and called for backup. I relayed everything I'd seen, though my words felt jumbled and frantic. A few minutes later, another ranger arrived. We decided to head back to the campsite together, flashlights in hand. As we approached, I felt a mix of dread and relief. I wasn't alone anymore. The air was colder now, the forest seemingly holding its breath. We found the campsite just as I had left it, except now, a tent flap rustled gently in the breeze. My fellow ranger and I called out again, but still no answer. With a growing sense of foreboding, we shone our lights around, but the family was nowhere to be found. I felt a prickle of panic. The figure could be nearby. We decided to search the area, staying close to one another. As we scoured the perimeter, I noticed something out of place on the ground, a set of deep, claw-like tracks leading away from the tent. They looked disturbingly human, but with elongated fingers that should not exist. I followed the tracks, my heart racing. They led to a clearing where the trees parted, revealing a dark, swirling mist. It felt wrong, unnatural. Suddenly, from the mist, a figure emerged. I recoiled, shining my flashlight at it, but as the beam illuminated the figure, I froze. It was the family, standing perfectly still, their faces blank and eyes wide. They weren't moving, but their bodies seemed to ripple, as if made of smoke. I stumbled backward, gasping as the mist began to close in around me. The ranger grabbed my arm, pulling me away. We ran back to the campsite, leaving the mist and the eerie figures behind. When we finally reached the ranger station, I turned to look back at the clearing. It was gone. The family, the mist, everything had vanished as if it never existed. We reported it, But when the authorities searched the area, there was nothing, no tracks, no signs of the family. It was as if they were swallowed by the forest. To this day, I cannot shake the feeling that whatever I encountered that night was more than a mere shadow. It lingers in the depths of the woods, waiting, watching. The park reopened, but I can never bring myself to go back to that part of the woods. The shadows seem to whisper secrets I am too afraid to hear. We had planned this camping trip for weeks, our usual way to unwind before winter set in. Yena, Matt, Aaron, and I packed our tents and sleeping bags, and I'd brought a little extra something, a stash of magic mushrooms to enhance the night. We were miles away from any marked trails, deep in the woods where only the sounds of nature kept us company. We set up camp by dusk, got a fire going, and started our little journey with the mushrooms, watching as the trees seemed to breathe and the stars felt close enough to touch. As the fire crackled and shadows danced, Yena suggested we take a walk through the forest. She grinned, saying it'd be creepy, and since we were all a bit out of our minds, it sounded like the perfect idea. We grabbed our flashlights, but something about the inky darkness seemed to swallow the light. Everything felt surreal, as if we'd stumbled into another world. We laughed and whispered as we moved deeper into the trees. But then, from somewhere nearby, a sound broke the stillness. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the rhythmic clanking of chains. The sound was distant but getting louder, moving closer. We froze, listening as the noise grew. And then, through the trees, a glow appeared, small pinpoints of light, steadily moving in our direction. Panicked, we ducked into the nearest bushes, crouching low as we peered out to see what was coming. My heart hammered in my chest, and every instinct screamed to run, but we were too mesmerized by the sight to move. Emerging through the trees, a procession of figures marched forward, each one draped in chains that rattled with every step. They wore white masks that covered their faces completely, expressionless and pale, giving no clue who or what was behind them. There were at least 10 of them, each holding a lantern that cast an eerie glow across their forms. The orange light flickered, illuminating shackles on their wrists and ankles, the chains connecting them to each other. Their movements were mechanical, precise, as if they'd been marching for centuries without a break. We held our breath, too terrified to even think about making a sound. The figures walked in eerie silence except for the relentless clanking of chains, heading right past our hiding spot. My pulse raced as one of them turned slightly, his mask facing directly toward our bush. The lantern light caught his empty eyes, and I felt a cold, uncheckable dread sink into my bones. I thought I'd been seen, but he turned away and kept walking. They moved onward, disappearing deeper into the woods, their lights fading until only the sound of chains remained. We waited until we were sure they were gone, and then we sat in silence, no one daring to speak. We stumbled back to the campsite in a daze, still reeling from what we'd seen. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle in the dark made us jolt. We stayed huddled together, barely able to close our eyes as we listened to the forest around us, half expecting those figures to return. At the first light of dawn, we decided it was time to go. As we approached the camp, something felt off. From a distance, we could see the tents were knocked over, and the fire we'd put out the night before was smoldering again, as if it had just been lit. We exchanged uneasy glances and moved cautiously toward the site. There, etched in the dirt next to our fire pit, was a message: "We will find you." The words looked fresh, like someone had scratched them in the ground mere moments before we arrived. None of us said a word. We knew what we had to do. We quickly packed what little was left of our things, each of us keeping a nervous eye on the trees, half expecting one of those masked figures to emerge. We practically sprinted back to the car, the weight of an unseen gaze pressing down on us the entire way. It wasn't until we were back on the road, the forest fading behind us, that anyone spoke, and even then, it was in hushed tones. We never went back to those woods, and we never told anyone else what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the clanking of chains echoing in my mind, and I see that mask staring through the darkness. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just me and my 3 friends. We packed up the tents, camping gear, and enough snacks to last the weekend. We drove out to a secluded spot deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town to escape the noise of civilization. I wasn't particularly excited about the isolation, but the others were eager to disconnect from everything for a while, and I went along with it. We arrived just before dusk, setting up our camp near a small, murky lake. The evening air was crisp, and the sky slowly darkened as we sat around the fire, cracking jokes and roasting marshmallows. There was something eerie about the place, though. The woods seemed quiet, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I didn't mention it to the others, didn't want to ruin the mood, but something didn't feel right. As the night wore on, we heard a few odd noises from the trees, branches creaking, leaves rustling. Nothing alarming, but it was enough to make me uneasy. We chalked it up to wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the campsite. Every now and then, I'd glance around, half expecting to see someone or something just beyond the tree line. But there was nothing there. Around midnight, we decided to go to bed. My friend Darren and I were sharing a tent, and the other had their own. I lay there in the dark, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Then, suddenly, I heard it, a loud, sharp crack, like something heavy breaking. I sat up, heart pounding, and turned to Darren. "Did you hear that?" He gradually nodded. "Yeah, probably a branch or something, but I wasn't so sure. It didn't sound like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't natural. It was too sharp, too deliberate." I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just spooked. But as I lay back down, I heard something else, faint whispering, coming from just outside the tent. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The whispering grew louder, but it wasn't in any language I could understand. The words were muffled, as if spoken through a veil of thick fabric. I wasn't about to get out and check. I nudged Darren, but he was asleep, snoring lightly. The whispering continued, now accompanied by soft, shuffling footsteps, like someone walking around the tent. I could feel my pulse racing, my body paralyzed with fear. My hand fumbled for the flashlight, but I couldn't find it in the dark. I didn't dare to speak, didn't dare to move. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and I heard a low, guttural breathing, right outside the tent. It was deep, labored, like someone or something was struggling to catch its breath. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, like my voice had been stolen. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. The woods were silent again. I waited a few minutes, heart thudding in my chest, before I finally mustered the courage to peek out of the tent. I unzipped the door just a crack. I scanning the dark, empty campsite. Nothing. I breathed a sigh of relief and pulled the zipper back down. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. I don't think I slept a wink, but somehow, the morning light eventually crept through the trees, and I could finally relax. At breakfast, I tried to act normal, like nothing had happened. But Darren wasn't so nonchalant. He'd been awake too, and he had heard the whispers too. He didn't know what to make of it, but he wasn't willing to stay another night to find out. We packed up our things early and started hiking back to the car. As we walked through the woods, something caught my eye, a strange, twisted tree just off the trail. The bark was peeling away in long strips, revealing something underneath, something dark and smooth, almost like stone. As I approached, I saw it more clearly. There were symbols carved into the bark, crude and jagged, as if someone had done it in a hurry. I shivered, feeling the hairs on my neck rise again. We kept walking, trying not to linger too long, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't leave me. Finally, we reached the clearing where we'd parked the car. I was relieved, ready to leave that place behind. But, as we loaded our gear into the trunk, I heard something else, soft tapping, like fingers on glass. I turned, and my stomach dropped. It was coming from the windows of the car, but no one was inside. No one had been inside all morning. I ran over and peered through the window, trying to see through the foggy glass. And there, staring back at me from the other side, was my own reflection grinning. My mouth was open in a wide, toothy smile, and my eyes were wild, unblinking, but I wasn't smiling. I froze, staring into the glass as my reflection seemed to shift, its grin widening impossibly, and a voice whispered in my ear, "You should have stayed." The sun was setting behind the trees as I drove deeper into the forest, the fading light casting eerie shadows on the winding dirt road. As a park ranger, I was accustomed to the quiet beauty of these woods, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with tension, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I had just received a report of a family camping near the edge of the park who hadn't checked in. As I parked near their campsite, I could see their tent in the distance, illuminated by a single lantern. I called out as I approached, but there was no response. I felt an unsettling knot in my stomach. The area was usually bustling with the sounds of nature, but the silence was overwhelming. The faint rustle of leaves made me jump, and I steeled myself for what I might find. When I reached the tent, I noticed the zipper was slightly open. I pushed it aside and peeked in, empty. The sleeping bags were still laid out, and the family's belongings were untouched. I called their names, but was met only by the rustling of branches and the distant call of an owl. My heart raced as I scanned the surrounding woods, looking for any sign of movement. I decided to check the nearby clearing, hoping to find them there. As I stepped away from the campsite, I felt a chill in the air. A sense of unease washed over me. I ventured further into the woods, the shadows growing longer and darker. The silence was oppressive. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the trees, making me jump. My flashlight beam swept across the underbrush, but nothing was there. I continued walking, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. My thoughts raced through scenarios. Had they gotten lost? Were they hurt? Just as I was about to turn back, I heard laughter in the distance. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The laughter sounded wrong, echoing and distorted, as if it were mocking me. I hurried toward the sound, calling out to the family. The laughter faded, replaced by a low growl that sent chills down my spine. I froze, listening intently. There it was again, the growl, closer this time. My instincts kicked in, and I felt the need to get back to the tent. I turned to head back, but the path seemed unfamiliar. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. Panic set in as I stumbled through the underbrush, my heart pounding. I tried to retrace my steps, but the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, disorienting me. I called out again, hoping for a response, but all I got was silence. Then, from behind me, I heard the laughter again, louder this time, echoing in my ears. It wasn't the sound of children, it was something sinister. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The growl was now a snarl, and I could feel something pursuing me. I burst into a small clearing, my flashlight flickering. In the center stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. My blood ran cold as I realized I was not alone. I stumbled back, the beam of my flashlight illuminating the figure's twisted face, a grotesque parody of a human smile stretching from ear to ear. In a panic, I turned to run again, the laughter morphing into a cacophony of voices, whispering my name, taunting me. I sprinted through the trees, my mind racing for a way out. Suddenly, I tripped and fell, the ground giving way beneath me. I landed hard, gasping for breath, and looked around. The figure loomed closer, but just as it reached out, I felt something cold grab my ankle. It yanked me back, but instead of panic, I felt relief wash over me as I saw the familiar shape of the family I had been searching for. They had been camping a few yards away, and it turned out they had wandered off for a night hike. They pulled me up just as the figure receded into the shadows, the laughter fading into the night. We scrambled back to the campsite, breathless but safe. As we packed up and prepared to leave, I glanced back into the woods, wondering if what I had seen was real or a trick of the mind. Later, while recounting the story to them, I noticed the family exchanging glances, their expressions troubled. They spoke softly among themselves, and it struck me that their laughter hadn't been joyful. It had been the same mocking laughter I heard in the woods. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that whatever lurked in those woods had not only been after me, it had been playing with all of us. We had been planning this camping trip for months. There were 5 of us, me, my brother, and 3 close friends. The weather was perfect, the kind of crisp, cool air that made you feel alive. We were excited, naive even, about what awaited us deep in the woods. There were no trails, no paths, just an untouched part of the forest, the kind of place that seemed to exist outside time. We set up our tents, started a fire, and spent the evening sharing stories, laughing, and watching the sky darken. The forest was alive with sounds, The rustling of leaves, distant owl calls, and the occasional snap of twigs under the weight of unseen creatures. At first, it was all part of the adventure, but as the night deepened, a strange unease began to settle over us. We joked about it, but something in the air felt different. There was a presence, something just beyond the firelight. Around midnight, we heard it, a soft scratching noise, just outside the perimeter of the fire. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal we knew. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. One of us joked that it was a bear or a raccoon, but even as we laughed, the scratching continued. And then, it stopped. Silence. We all exchanged uneasy glances. Our laughter died in our throats as the air grew heavier. Another sound. This time, it was a low thud, like something large had fallen nearby. It was followed by an eerie, unnatural silence. Our eyes darted toward the edge of the firelight, the trees just beyond the reach of our flame. The night felt to still. I stood up, wanting to reassure everyone. "I'll check it out," I said, trying to sound confident, though my heart was hammering. The others hesitated, but none of them wanted to be the ones to sit alone by the fire. They followed me as I grabbed a flashlight and stepped beyond the circle of warmth. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush. "It's nothing," I muttered, more to myself than to anyone else, but something gnawed at me. I scanned the area, moving the flashlight back and forth, when I noticed something strange. A few feet away, just under a tree, a pile of leaves had been disturbed. But the odd thing wasn't the pile, it was the shape beneath it. It looked wrong. The pile wasn't natural, it was too neat, too perfect, almost like a body. I froze. Then I heard it, a soft, shallow breath, too close, too real. It came from just behind me. I whipped around, my heart skipping a beat. But there was nothing but darkness. "What is it?" My brother's voice trembled behind me. The others stood just out of the flashlight's reach, their faces pale in the dark. "Stay here," I whispered, taking a step forward toward the strange pile. The flashlight's beam quivered in my hand as I moved closer, my feet crunching on the dry leaves. I reached down to move the leaves, and then I saw it. A hand, pale, twisted, and partially buried. The hand of something human. No, the fingers were too long, too thin, the nails sharp and yellow. I jerked back, but as I did, something in the trees above moved. My eyes shot upward, but there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then I heard the voice. It was faint at first, but growing clearer. A whisper. "Help? Me, please." I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. I knew something was behind me. I could feel it. I turned, and there it was, a face, not far off. It was pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed too wide, too empty. The mouth stretched into a twisted grin that was more of a sneer, the skin hanging loosely, as if it had been drained of life. It didn't belong there. It didn't move like anything I had ever seen. It was too still, too unnatural. I screamed. The others bolted into motion, running, but the thing's gaze never left me. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath shallow and quick. I almost tripped over my own feet as I turned and sprinted toward the fire. But the thing it followed us. We made it back to the fire pit, gasping for breath, the flames casting frantic shadows in every direction. But, as we huddled there, the scratching started again. This time, it was closer. The leaves on the ground shifted. Slowly, almost casually, the thing stepped out from the shadows, its feet barely touching the earth. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. We all stared at it, waiting for the next move, but it didn't make another sound. That's when the real horror struck. We realized it wasn't alone. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw another figure, crouched low to the ground, stepping into view. Then another, and another, all of them pale, gaunt, their eyes wide and empty. They didn't move, they just stood there in the darkness, staring at us. It wasn't just one thing, there were dozens of them. And then, just as quickly, they were gone. No movement, no sound. Only the rustling of leaves in the distance.